The life of this young man was extremely ordinary. He was born in a regular home, had typical days, and followed a boring routine. He imagined his existence would end just like that, with nothing special ever happening. But he was wrong. After discovering the hero's destiny, everything began to change. On yet another lonely day at home, he thought about how he had little interest in school life. However, there was one thing that satisfied him: playing games alone. In that virtual world, at least, he could be the protagonist of something. He used cheat codes and became an invincible champion, with no obstacles in his way. He was the only player who played at his own pace and could save or load his progress whenever he wanted. On top of that, he streamed his gameplay live. One day, he received a monetary donation, followed by a second donation of $1,000. He was completely shocked. The donor simply asked him to check his email. The message was addressed to him as Master of the Game, his nickname on the streams. The sender was a frequent subscriber of his channel, who also happened to be an indie game developer. He explained that he had created a game entirely on his own, which had taken a lot of time and effort, but no one had managed to finish the closed beta. That's why he was asking the streamer to test the game and give feedback on its difficulty. Curious, the Master of the Game wondered, what if I managed to beat this? Could someone as ordinary as me become special? With that in mind, he installed the game called Hero's Destiny. The game's story was set in the year 294 of the Empire, during the invasion of the United Kingdom of Jaipur. The Kingdom of Rock had been engulfed in flames, marking the beginning of a chaotic era. The protagonist, that is, the player himself, was born with a small and insignificant soul. His goal was to survive the chaos and become a hero. The ultimate mission was to defeat the resurrected evil god and claim the divine throne. The Master of the Game noted that the graphics weren't impressive, which made sense since the game was made by just one person. Without thinking much, he entered the name he always used, Master of the Game. As soon as he entered the virtual world, he arrived on the continent of Erin. He thought the game looked easy, especially since there was no tutorial. Right at the start, he met the village chief, who asked the reason for his visit. There were no preset options. He could write freely. Finding this amusing, he typed something absurd, threatening the whole village for gold. The village chief reacted with a precise strike, and his character died. Intrigued, the Master of the Game realized he could actually talk to the NPCs. He restarted the game, and this time decided to pretend to be weak. He said he was lost, hungry, and asked for compassion. The village chief responded with sarcasm, saying he already looked pathetic enough, but still offered him shelter. The character rested in his house, had some tea, and was poisoned. Suspecting that the game creator might be controlling the characters, he turned off the internet. Even so, he died grotesquely, losing his tongue after saying nonsense. That made him realize that the developer truly was the one who had sent the game. It was already late at night, so he saved his progress and reflected on how complex the interaction system with NPCs was. He began to believe that if the world of Hero's Destiny really existed, he would accept it as reality. He now understood why no one had managed to complete the closed beta. The game was genuinely fascinating. Motivated by the desire to become special, the Master of the Game fully immersed himself in the experience. He was so committed that he didn't even notice the time passing. Years went by trying to win. 10 years passed. Now, he worked in an office. A colleague named Suyun handed him some documents he had requested, and shortly after, he had already finished the task. Then, she approached again, and somewhat shyly, asked if he would like to go out later for a beer or do something together. He apologized, saying he had something important to do at home, and wished her a good evening. Suyun, a bit disheartened, commented that she'd been turned down again that day. Back at his apartment, the Master of the Game decided that night would be the last. He would finish Hero's Destiny once and for all. He stayed up all night playing, and finally won. After so many years, he became the first human to conquer the lowest level of the divine throne. Even with that victory, he didn't feel different. All he wanted, from the very beginning, was to feel special, even if only inside a game. But his life hadn't changed. He felt only emptiness. It was as if he had lived two lives at the same time, and neither of them was truly his. The game had charismatic characters full of personality. They were so realistic that sometimes it was hard to distinguish them from real people. But now it was over. The Master of the Game had finally completed Hero's Destiny. After the credits, an unexpected question appeared on the screen. Did he wish to begin a new adventure? If he chose yes, he would be transported to the continent of Erin. Once there, he wouldn't be able to return until the mission was completed. Without thinking much, he wondered if it was a secret stage or a continuation. It didn't matter. What he wanted was to feel that adrenaline again, and so, he accepted. Then, his vision darkened and he was transported. Now, he was the Apostle, the Master of the Game, inside the very world of Hero's Destiny. When he opened his eyes, he felt his chest burning as if it were on fire. Breathing was difficult. He looked around, confused, trying to understand where he was. Before he could process anything, a man appeared at his side. With relief, the man said that if it hadn't been for the high-quality potion, he wouldn't have survived until dawn. But that man wasn't speaking to him, he was speaking to Prince Calyx. Not understanding anything, the Master of the Game now in that body heard the name and tried to ask who he was. But what came out of his mouth was a strange language. He was sure he had spoken in Korean, but the sound he heard was completely different. Still, he could understand what was being said. That's when he felt another sharp pain in his chest. The man beside him, Russell, apologized for being so blunt, but explained that the pain was a side effect of the potion acting on his senses. He would feel better soon. He just needed time to recover. Then Russell left the room, promising to return later. When morning came, the Master of the Game, now inside the body of Calyx Shenzhen, got up with great effort. Looking in the mirror, mirror, he had the strange sensation that the body wasn't his. He knew he remembered his 30 years of life, but at the same time, couldn't even recall his own name. Facing his reflection, he asked himself who that person was. Then, a status window appeared before his eyes. Now he knew. He was Calyx Sejensen, a 15-year-old noble and prince of the county of Sejensen. He held no official position, had no defined personality traits, and was still recovering from a severe chest wound. He was at level 8 out of 37, had 3 stars of fame, 14% public support, and no other relevant information. That's when he realized he was no longer playing. He had truly been transported to the continent of Aaron, the main setting of the game. And the scariest part was that everything was real. The pain, the physical details, the sounds, none of it was a simulation. This was his new life. Still adjusting to the name Calyx, he thought again about the status screen, and as if it were connected to his mind, it appeared once more. He needed to gather information as quickly as possible, because surviving in this world would not be easy. The title and surname Jensen indicated that he belonged to the main lineage of the noble family. That meant he was a legitimate heir. That's when someone knocked at the door. He flinched immediately. He wasn't ready yet to pretend to be someone else, but he had to act like he really was Prince Calyx. Fortunately, it was just a maid bringing his medicine. When she entered and bowed respectfully, he felt brief relief. However, when he tried to ask her name, he realized his mistake. If he didn't know the name of his own maid, he wouldn't be convincing as a prince. Luckily, he noticed he could access her status window. Her name was Lila, 23 years old, a commoner affiliated with the Viscounty of Kosala, a curious detail since it was a different territory from Shensen. Additionally, her combat strength was high. Although she couldn't use mana, she had been trained as part of the special forces. She was true military elite, which made it strange that someone like her would be serving merely as a maid. Calyx grew suspicious immediately. When Layla offered the medicine, he sensed something was wrong. He told her to leave it on the counter, but she insisted that he drink it immediately. So, he pretended to knock the cup over. However, with impressive reflexes, she caught it before it hit the ground. That alarmed him. He thought he must not drink that liquid no matter what. He was nearly certain it was poison. His plan was simple. He would fake passing out, preventing her from forcing him to drink more. When she caught him and asked if he was okay, he realized his acting might have worked. Amid the confusion, he tried to remember details about the Kosala family. He knew he was born from the first wife, who was already dead, and that he had an older half-brother, probably 16 years old, son of the second wife. He deduced that the Kosala surname came from her. He concluded that Lila had been sent by his stepmother, the second wife, as a disguised assassin. If he died, the brother would inherit the title of Count. It made sense. The game had begun. As expected, Hero's destiny would be anything but easy. Cautiously, Calyx thanked Layla and said he was feeling better. To probe for more information, he asked how her mother was doing. She replied that the Countess was very worried about the young master's condition and asked that he never do anything so drastic again. At that moment, Calyx understood. The previous owner of that body had tried to kill himself. The pain in the chest, the lack of memory, and the status details clearly indicated that he had stabbed himself. Calyx told Layla that he wouldn't cause any more trouble and dismissed her with a gesture, saying she could leave, but she insisted, reminding him that he still hadn't taken the medicine. Trying to hide his nervousness, he asked if she was staying just to confirm that. This was a serious problem. He couldn't refuse directly, because he knew the kind of person he was dealing with. Layla was clearly an elite assassin. He, on the other hand, was a 30-year-old man trapped in the body of a weak and wounded teenager. If she decided to attack him, he'd die without being able to resist. He had no choice. He had to drink whatever was in that cup. But something didn't add up. If she truly wanted to kill him, why use poison? She could have simply stabbed him and fled. Perhaps she was concerned about witnesses or appearances. In that case, poison would simulate a natural or accidental death. It would be a slow, silent death. Seeing his hesitation, Layla offered to help him drink it if he was in pain. That's when Calyx remembered a rule he had learned from playing Hero's Destiny. If you want to survive, always imagine the worst. Never trust anyone. Always be ready for anything. At that moment, he felt things were really starting to get interesting. The game was pushing him from the very beginning. With no time to think, he grabbed the cup and drank it all in one go. Immediately, the system notified him that he had been poisoned with the slow death condition. He had expected this. He needed to escape that situation as fast as possible. He thought of Russell, the only person he could possibly trust, and asked Layla call him immediately. When she asked why, he firmly replied that servants didn't need explanations and ordered her to go at once. As she left, Calyx thought about the high-grade potion Russell had used to save him before. That elixir was as rare and valuable as a castle. Someone who would use such a treasure to save another person could only be acting with good intentions. That gave him a bit of hope. Without wasting time, he forced himself to vomit everything he had just ingested. However, that wasn't enough. The poison was still acting. His eyelids felt heavy, and his body was beginning to fail. He was losing strength. Just as he wondered if he was going to die right there, without any meaning to this new life, something under the dresser caught his eye. It was an old bottle with curdled white liquid. Picking it up, he realized it was just spoiled goat milk. For a moment, he thought it was useless, but then he remembered. At the beginning of the game, there was a hidden tip that yogurt worked as an antidote to slow death poison. If spoiled goat milk could be considered yogurt, then it was worth a try. With no time for doubt, he drank it all at once. despite the awful taste. In that moment, he swore he would take revenge on that damned maid. The very next second, Russell appeared in the room, calling for him and waking him up. For an instant, Calyx wondered if it was deja vu or if the game had restarted. But no, he was alive. Russell, concerned, asked what had happened in the room, why everything was covered in vomit, and why he was sleeping on the floor. Calyx couldn't believe it. He was alive. He could feel his heart pounding. He never wanted to feel that fear of dying again. Before anything else, he needed to confirm the data of that man. He opened the status window and saw Russell Nigel, 58 years old, Viscount, acting administrator of the county of Shenzhen. He was an honest and strict soldier, with combat class level 6, a trustworthy man. He understood that Russell had only used that rare potion because it was the proper protocol. He hadn't done it out of loyalty, only out of duty. The former count had died without naming a successor, so Russell was in command until a new heir could be confirmed. Trusting him, Calyx decided to tell him everything. He explained what had happened, though he admitted he had no proof or witnesses. He said he suspected Layla, but without evidence, it was impossible to accuse her. Russell listened calmly and replied that his duty was to serve both Calyx and the other potential heir. Without proof, nothing could be done. Calyx, frustrated, asked if they really expected him to keep drinking the medicine sent by the rival family. Russell answered coldly. He said Calyx had lost part of his memory, and that at the moment, the county was facing serious financial issues. The budget was tight, and any help from outside, even from the rival family, should be received with gratitude. But Calyx couldn't accept that. He knew he needed proof to convince Russell, and since Layla thought he was dead, she would likely return to check. That was the opportunity he needed. With that in mind, Calyx asked Russell for just one thing, a single favor. 4 hours later, the plan was in motion. In the castle of Shenzhen, a stealthy figure moved silently across the rooftops. It was Lila, returning to the room she believed now held only a corpse. She noticed the security had been reinforced, but no one was guarding the door. Suspicious, she continued anyway. Upon entering the room, she saw Calyx apparently asleep in bed. She believed the poison had already taken effect. After all, she had used a special substance. She thought he had died peacefully. Without hesitation, she began to rummage through his belongings, looking for documents or any useful information. She was just about to leave when she was caught by surprise. Before she could react, a cold blade touched her neck. She'd been caught red-handed. With no way out, Lila only muttered that it was already too late. According to her, Calyx was already dead, and the Shenzhen clan would soon belong to the only remaining heir, young Master Grambini. Layla told Russell that he had sworn loyalty to the Genshin clan, not to a mere young master, but Calyx replied that everything was happening exactly as he had predicted. He remarked that slow death was quite dramatic, and commented that poisoning was a common tactic among noble families. That much he knew, but he also understood the risks if the attempt was discovered. During the confrontation, Layla managed to dodge Russell's first strike, but was no match for his strength. He grabbed her, broke her arm, and then delivered a punch that cracked one of her ribs. Calyx watched the scene and realized that although he understood power levels in theory, it was very different to witness firsthand just how much 3 combat classes could separate 2 people. Russell's strength was overwhelming. Even though poisoning was common, Calyx made it clear. No one left evidence or witnesses, and attempted assassination against a noble was a crime punishable by execution. Now, he had both the evidence and the witness. At that moment, Layla passed out, and Calyx, using the system interface, could sense her mana core. That was how he measured people's combat level. Russell commented that she didn't seem to master any mana-breathing techniques. At best, she was at the level of a well-trained elite soldier. He looked at Calyx and realized the young man seemed to know exactly what had happened. When Calyx had asked him to keep an eye on Layla, he hadn't expected such a well-executed plan. Next, Calyx suggested tying Layla up for interrogation. There were many questions to be asked. Later, she was completely injured, restrained to a chair. Calyx poured a liquid over her broken arm and explained that if he had drunk the poison, within 3 to 6 hours his breathing would have slowly stopped. It was a poison known to cause a peaceful death, like falling asleep. He said he had already attempted suicide in the past, so if poison were found in his body, no one would suspect murder. He added that if Lila had used a fast-acting poison and been willing to die with him, she would have succeeded. But she didn't, and that said a lot. Calyx stated she didn't want to die. That meant her loyalty to Countess Stella wasn't enough to make her sacrifice her own life. He asked Russell to bring something that would make her talk. Soon, the man returned with a pill, threw it into Layla's mouth, and forced her to swallow it with spoiled goat milk. She involuntarily swallowed everything. Dazed, Lila asked what he had done. Calyx replied that since she had tried to poison him, she would now face the same fate. He asked if she'd ever heard of Sidis's puppet poison. When she reacted in shock, saying it was impossible for a spoiled count's son to have access to such a powerful toxin, he replied that with money, anything was possible. He even said the main ingredient was something as simple as white radish. Layla asked how he knew that. Calyx reflected that in a world without the internet, simply knowing the right words made him seem like an expert. He then said he would let her go. She should return to her master and tell them the assassination had been successful. Layla asked why she would obey. Calyx responded coldly coldly. Because she wanted to live. Sidi's puppet poison had more than 3,000 different antidotes, and the only one that would work for her was stored in his mind. If she wanted to risk her one and only life, she could ignore him, but that would be a mistake. When he asked what her decision would be, Layla began to feel intense pain and begged to be released. Calyx noticed her desperation and sudden obedience, suspecting she might just be pretending, but she was trembling so much that she pleaded for mercy, saying she couldn't take it anymore. He realized the spoiled milk was taking effect and warned Russell that if they didn't release her soon, she'd mess herself right there. Russell, hesitant, reminded him that she had tried to kill him, but Calyx insisted that she was an important witness. It was better to preserve at least her dignity as a human being. At that moment, Layla, sweating and ashamed, begged again to be taken out of there before she wet and soiled herself. Later, Layla claimed she would return and say that the assassination had been successfully completed. Calyx knew that to fully deceive whoever was behind Layla, they would need someone capable of mobilizing knights. Russell then asked how the young master had acquired so much knowledge. Calyx just laughed and said that if he claimed to have read it all in a book, Russell wouldn't believe him. And it was true. Russell stated that anyone who published something like that would have already been executed. A forbidden book like that would never be lying around. Calyx thought to himself that Russell wouldn't believe him if he said he was possessed by someone from another world either. So he decided to use a different argument. He asked if Russell remembered the dagger that had been stabbed into his chest. Russell confirmed. He wanted to know why that was relevant now. Calyx explained that the dagger was a relic left by his mother. It was said to have mystical power, and now he had finally unlocked it. Still, Calyx felt that explanation wasn't enough to convince the knight. So he added that no one would ever imagine the way to unleash the dagger's true power was by stabbing it into one's own heart. Russell, intrigued, admitted it was curious, but questioned why, if it was such a powerful treasure, the weapon's name wasn't known throughout the kingdom. That's when Calyx asked if he had ever heard of the Dagger of Kriya. Russell asked if the dagger Calyx mentioned was truly the legendary Dagger of Kriya, and Calyx thought he had finally taken the bait. Russell commented that, if it truly was the greatest of treasures, it would make sense that the young master possessed so much knowledge. However, he wanted to know if Calyx had told this to anyone else. Calyx assured him that he hadn't, and that Russell was the first to hear it. Then Calyx asked what he thought about Layla's testimony. According to her, the movements of Russell's father, Count Koshirin, had been leaked. A knight who was about to reach Class 7 had been killed in a monster attack, and the entire group of knights protecting him had also died. It was far too absurd to be a coincidence. Russell realized that Calyx was seeking his support, but knew he couldn't take sides in succession disputes. Even so, he couldn't help but acknowledge that Count Koshirin's death raised many questions. There was no proof, only suspicion, but he still felt he shouldn't get involved in political matters. Calyx, however, insisted, asking why his father had died. If it had been an assassination, then who was behind it? And if the culprit were discovered, what would the revenge look like? He firmly declared that his own father, the Lord, had been murdered. He suspected that the Kosala family was involved, more specifically Countess Stella and her son Grambini. According to him, if Grambini became the new count, Russell wouldn't be able to do anything, let alone seek revenge. Calyx encouraged him not to give up, just because the situation was difficult. He said that loyalty didn't mean obeying a family that had plotted murder. He asked if that was what being a knight meant to Russell. Faced with these words, Russell bowed before him and swore loyalty to the young master Calyx, although he warned that he was giving up a belief he had held for nearly 60 years. Calyx then thought that he now had Russell, a Class 6 warrior and the most powerful man in the county, on his side. He had placed the reins of revenge around the neck of the tiger, who had always followed his own path. Calyx expressed that it was an honor to have him serve, especially since he didn't even hold a knight's title. Russell reassured him, saying he would make him a strong man. Calyx, realizing things were getting too intense, decided to change the subject. If things kept going like that, Russell might make him train with a sword right then and there. He remarked that the Countess had used poison in a treacherous way, but made the mistake of leaving behind evidence and witnesses. With that, they could dismantle her faction. It was the beginning of vengeance. Russell agreed, calling the moment a blessing, but wanted to know what he should do next. Calyx then explained the whole plan. The next morning, everyone was gathered in the Great Hall for an emergency meeting. Countess Stella was sitting on the Count's throne, which immediately raised eyebrows among those present. There were also comments that the knights had been on high alert during the night. The Countess then stated that everyone there should know that the night before, young Master Calyx had once again tried to kill himself by ingesting slow-acting poison. One of the elders confirmed that it was a well-known poison, and commented that Calyx likely hadn't survived. Another added that with the heir's death, the faction disputes would lose meaning. Stella believed that with Calyx out of the way, Grambini's succession was secured. But at that exact moment, Calyx, hidden among those present, quietly said that the conversation was getting interesting. He turned to Russell and asked if everything was ready. Russell, in his armor, sword in hand, assured him that he would follow him even to hell if necessary. Then the two burst through the hall's doors. Everyone was shocked. The presence of interim administrator Russell at Calyx's side was especially surprising. Calyx stepped forward to the throne and declared that such a seat was not appropriate for an ordinary woman like Stella. She remarked that he was being rude and asked how he was feeling. Calyx replied with irony, saying that because of someone, he had taken poison, but was lucky to survive. He admitted he vomited it all out shortly after. Stella, outraged, said that anyone hearing that would think she was the culprit. She reminded him that he had never recognized her as his mother, but now he was truly accusing her of attempted murder. She emphasized that they were in the sacred hall, a public space, and that he should be responsible for his words. Calyx, however, said that she seemed very confident for someone about to be exposed. The Countess asked what he was talking about. Then Calyx announced the arrival of the witness, Lila, who had been imprisoned. The Countess was in shock, unable to believe what she was seeing. Calyx asked her to introduce herself. Layla revealed her true identity. She was a first-class agent from the Special Operations Unit of the Kosala family's Shadow Corps. She explained that this group gathered orphans with combat talent and subjected them to brutal training in the highlands of Gorda camp. Only the most exceptional survived and were then sent out with false identities to different locations. Layla's false identity was that of Countess Stella's maid. Calyx asked if Stella knew her true identity, and Layla confirmed that she did. The Countess tried to deflect, claiming it was all a conspiracy, but the elders began to murmur. They remarked that Layla had worked in the mansion for 5 years, and that this could not be ignored. Some even mentioned that the Kosala family would be formally protested because of it. Then one of the elders asked why Viscount Russell was so quiet. He wanted to know if he truly believed the words of a mere maid. Russell intervened, saying that Lila was not a mere maid, but a criminal caught in the act. She had just admitted herself to being a spy from the Kosala family. He said that whether or not it was a conspiracy could only be judged based on the full testimony. Meanwhile, one of the members present demanded that the treasurer stop with such nonsense, and quickly the factions began to clash in the hall. Despite the chaos, Calyx stayed focused and continued the interrogation with the witness. He asked Layla, while she was still posing as a maid, what her assigned mission had been. Layla explained that once a month she would send reports containing confidential information. She spied on the financial records prepared by the chief treasurer, with details about the territory's income and expenses. She also reported on the schedule and travel routes of the late Count Kosherin, as well as political movements within the circle of vassals loyal to the throne. Calyx then wanted to know what her most recent mission had been. Layla answered that she had deceived Prince Calyx, making him ingest the poison known as slow death. After that, she broke into his room with the intention of planting a forged suicide note to make his death appear as a suicide. Calyx asked what the result was. Layla confessed that she had succeeded in making him take the poison, but when she entered the room, she was surprised by Regent Russell and captured immediately. At that moment, Stella, in desperation, ordered her to be quiet. She claimed there was no proof, no concrete evidence, and had to be restrained so she wouldn't lunge at the hearing table. Carrick then asked for evidence. Russell presented the forged suicide note and confirmed that the night before, he had caught Layla trying to sneak into Calyx's room. He also showed the enchanted scroll known as Memory of the Earth, a magical item well known among the nobles present. The scroll was enchanted to reveal, through visions, the malicious intentions of those who touched it. That magic, he stated, would allow them to discover who had given the direct order to Layla. In light of this, the treasurer thought the evidence needed to be made public as soon as possible. Otherwise, they would all be finished. Calyx, meanwhile, saw that behind all those lies, the truth was finally emerging. He gave the order for the soldiers to enter the hall. They came to arrest everyone involved with Countess Stella's faction. The treasurer, stunned, wanted to know what this meant. Russell replied that he had personally reviewed the scroll's content. He said the information was shocking and that, to avoid disorder and turmoil, he had no choice but to summon the knights. Stella protested, saying that bringing armed soldiers into the sacred Great Hall was the same as committing a coup. Grambini, in panic, pleaded with his mother for help, but Stella understood, deep down, that the action of the neutral knights could only mean one thing. Undeniable evidence had been revealed. Now that the knights officially supported Calyx, she and her faction were cornered. Calyx then asked Russell what the punishment was, under the kingdom's noble law, for a noble who tried to assassinate a blood relative. Russell answered that the penalty was death by hanging. Faced with this, Stella finally surrendered. She said that Grambini knew nothing, that she had acted on her own. Even though she wasn't his blood mother, she still considered him a son and begged them to believe her. Calyx asked if that was true, but Lila declared that, at the moment she received the mission, Grambini was also present. Stella, desperate, denied it, saying it was a lie. However, Calyx thought to himself that maybe it really was a lie, but it didn't matter. Those who ordered assassinations were cowards, and now, finally, the fox hunt had reached its climax. At that moment, Grambini stood up and knelt before Calyx. The room fell silent. Everyone was shocked by his action. Grambini, with his head bowed, begged. No matter what happened to him, he only asked that they spare his mother's life. Stella scolded him, ordering him to return to his seat. People began to comment that things had gone too far. The commotion was so intense this that they began to see Calyx as the true villain of the situation. He himself recognized that internally, reflecting that maybe Grambini had been manipulating everything from the start. Even so, Calyx accepted. He said that if that was Grambini's wish, he could not ignore it. He stated that those who admitted their crimes could have their sentences reduced. If Grambini confessed his sins there, he might be spared, but he had to remember that words spoken before the court could not be taken back. Calyx asked him to think carefully before answering. Stella, still gagged, tried to stop him but couldn't speak. Calyx then asked who Grambini thought he was to give orders to his older brother. The people present looked at each other and began to question whether he still considered them brothers after everything that had happened. The indignation was widespread. How could someone who tried to kill Calyx continue treating him that way? The treasurer, seeing the tide turn, realized that this was the chance to weaken the Countess's faction. Although they said Calyx was arrogant, Russell gave the final order. Arrest all the guilty ones immediately. Stella was captured without mercy. She was gagged in front of everyone, while the knights dragged away the members of her faction. Calyx then turned again to Grambini. He asked if he admitted to the crime of trying to poison him. The young man hesitated for a moment, but finally answered yes. He admitted it. Calyx thought Grambini had no other choice. If he kept insisting, even the public sympathy he had earned would be lost. Perhaps he had planned everything carefully, weighing each move. With the confession in hand, Calyx declared that, because Grambini had voluntarily admitted guilt before the evidence was presented, he would not be executed. He would keep the scroll's contents secret to preserve the family's honor. However, as punishment, Grambini would have to seal his own mana core. The sentence struck like thunder. Grambini was in shock. In the Kingdom of Rock, a land ruled by knights, society was strictly divided between noble knights, commoners, and slaves. The only way to belong to the ruling class was to master mana and strengthen one's body. Sealing the mana core was essentially a social death. Grambini now faced the most difficult choice of his life. He knew that if he didn't accept the punishment, his mother's crimes would be fully exposed, and she would be hanged. He had to stop it even if it meant sacrificing everything. Stella believed that sealing the mana core of a noble was the same as condemning him to death. But even knowing this, Grambini said he would fulfill the promise he had made. Russell assured him that it would be carried out, and then Grambini, without hesitation, took the scroll and began the process. Stella, distressed, knew that once sealed, not even a great master could reopen a knight's mana core. It was an irreversible decision. Her son's future was at risk. Even so, Grambini tore the scroll, and his mana core was sealed. He thought it was nothing, as long as he could save his mother's life. Stella, however, felt that everything was over. Even though he was her son, he still didn't understand how the world worked. Grambini, trying to console her, told her not to be sad. In the end, he had always wanted to be an artist, but Stella was no longer in control. She looked like a furious beast before Calyx. She broke free from her chains and cursed him, saying she would never forgive him. Calyx thought that with his core sealed, Grambini would never surpass the level of a Class 3 knight, the same as Layla, and that still bothered him. Maybe he should feel guilty for stealing someone's future, but he decided not to. To him, this was still just a game. There was no reason to get attached. Now that he had made his move, there was no turning back. He ordered Russell to finalize the punishment. Countess Stella and Prince Grambini would be confined in the castle annex until the investigations were concluded. In the meantime, neither of them could have contact with outsiders. Chief Treasurer Gidris was also accused of leaking confidential documents. He would be stripped of his position and imprisoned for questioning. Outraged, Gidris shouted, asking how a mere soldier dared arrest him. The soldier, without hesitation, punched him in the stomach, knocking off his wig and revealing a shiny bald head. The onlookers couldn't contain their laughter at the scene. The people at the table understood in that instant that something had changed. Prince Calyx, who until then had neither title nor real political support, now had the backing of someone as influential as Russell. It was as if the succession dispute had already been decided. Russell, though still humble before the others, made it clear that he now acted in Calyx's name. He then turned to the guard captain, Garrett, and informed him that he was temporarily suspended from duty. It was necessary to avoid misunderstandings and outside contact. One person then stood and declared that the fault for everything lay with him, due to negligence. He took responsibility and asked to resign from his post. Calyx recognized the man as Garrett, someone respected by his subordinates for both his competence and integrity. But he had already arranged everything with Russell. He declared to the head of administration that he would not accept his resignation. In addition, Russell handed over a list of administrators suspected of involvement in the case and advised that they be suspended only to avoid a shutdown of the county's operations. Everything had to keep running. Calyx approached Garrett and explained that all treasurers except 4 were under investigation. He said it would be necessary to appoint replacements immediately. Garrett pleaded for leniency toward the less guilty. If all the veterans were removed, they would face serious problems maintaining the administration. Calyx reflected that the most important thing was to have absolutely trustworthy people handling the finances. He asked if it would be acceptable to halt the investigations out of fear of an operational gap. He said they might even be grateful for the generosity he was offering. Garrett, resigned, admitted that some of the people involved had simply chosen the wrong side, but Calyx said he had already made his decision. That was enough. Garrett was surprised. He thought that boy was completely different from the young master he had known before. Calyx had been indecisive, insecure, soft-hearted. Now he radiated radiated resolve. Other members at the table began to comment that if Russell, the symbol of military strength, and Garrett, the symbol of administration, were on Calix's side, the balance of power in Shensen County was crumbling. Calix thought that by now, control of the county was almost entirely in his hands. He activated the system to analyze Garrett's status. 61 years old, minor baron, affiliated with the county of Zessen. He had an S rating in administration, P in finance, E in military power, D in diplomacy, and D in development. More than that, Calix was analyzing the status of everyone in the room. That made the game even more interesting. He had thought Garrett would be difficult to deal with, but he turned out to be a predictable figure. It wasn't hard to manipulate someone like that. His next step would be to completely eliminate the opposing faction, and also those who remained neutral. To Calix, they were the most useless. He would force everyone to compete for his loyalty, and use only those who survived the selection. At that moment, everyone present was terrified to see the cold smile on Calix's face. The room, once full of whispers, fell completely silent, until the nobles began to beg for his mercy. Calix, satisfied, asked everyone to calm down. He said there was still time for everything, but not even Russell felt at ease with the scene. It was a depressing sight, a bunch of nobles on their knees, begging before Calix. That same night, exhausted after an intense day, Calix finally lay down. His body felt heavy and his mind restless. He thought about how he had always been an average person. His studies were average, his looks were unremarkable, and his life so far had nothing special. But at some point, he had believed that if he were the only one to finish that game, maybe he could become someone unique. However, at the end of the journey, all he felt was emptiness. Then he remembered the divine throne of the continent of Erin, the final goal of that world. He recalled how it all began. He was born into the game with a small and insignificant soul, in a world in chaos, where he had to survive and become a hero. He wondered if his wish to be reborn on that continent had truly been granted. The system seemed to have interpreted his desire as a legitimate request, and now, there he was. There was no turning back. He thought that if he could complete this world too, and once again claim the divine throne, maybe another wish would be fulfilled. As he drifted off to sleep, he declared to himself that he would win once more. The next morning, he woke up motivated and wondered where he should start. He knew all the counties in the game very well, so it felt strange that he had never heard of Zessen County. When he opened the map through the system, a message appeared. He had already conquered the continent of Erin. As a reward for completing the game, all the map markers were revealed a true treasure map. All the locations of dungeons, relics, and hidden treasures were now visible to him. Calix muttered that this would be easy, but there was an important question. What year was it? He discovered it was the Imperial year, 289, while the main storyline of the game, Fate of Heroes, only began in 294. That explained why he had never heard of Zessen County. It had disappeared from the map before the official story began. He remembered Russell mentioning financial difficulties and understood why he had almost died. They didn't even have enough money to hire a decent maid, so he decided to check the territory's financial status. The situation was unbelievable. He even considered gathering what little money remained and fleeing, but even then, he wouldn't get far. He thought that money could be earned through effort, but land was only acquired through bloodline. He had fought too hard to conquer that territory, and throwing it away would be a waste. He analyzed that the revenue from agricultural land taxes wasn't much lower than other counties. The military budget had only temporarily increased the previous year, without major consequences. So where was the real problem? Calix began reviewing 10 years of records. He discovered that the biggest issue was the complete breakdown of trade with the desert kingdom of Madrosa. This had directly affected import and export tariffs, and the county had taken out an absurd amount of loans. The annual interest exceeded the total tax revenue. It was a bottomless pit. But then he remembered something. If he needed information, there was a certain filthy pig locked in the underground prison. He went down there, determined to pressure him for what he needed. Upon arriving, he was hit by a strong sewage smell. The drainage system down there was completely inefficient. One of the guards, surprised, asked what brought Prince Calix to such a place. He replied that he wanted to speak with Gidris, the former treasurer. The guard, surprised by the young master's presence, said he never imagined he'd set foot there. Calix then reflected that the man was probably one of the old guard captain's subordinates, someone who bowed to power. He concluded that, like many others, the man simply followed whoever was on top. He took the opportunity to tell the guard that if there were any innocent prisoners held there by mistake, they deserved a chance to clear their names. The guard agreed, but pointed out that it was also necessary to review the cases of dangerous criminals who might have been released. Calix then appointed the guard as the one responsible for screening the prison. He realized how easily that man, who had served the former captain for so long, could be manipulated. Now, he saw Calix as the new dominant power, and would try to take advantage of his goodwill. Calix reflected, somewhat uncomfortably, that he was starting to resemble the kind of politician he had always despised. Shortly after, he asked where Gidris was. He found the former treasurer flailing inside a cell, screaming that he would get revenge and kill everyone. Calix, unfazed, asked how he planned to escape. Was he going to dig with his fingernails? Gidris, however, replied with a cynical smile. He said he had just been waiting for the prince, and asked if he remembered the debt he owed him. Calix was confused. What debt was that? He said that if this was the route Gidris wanted to take, he might need need some strong ropes for the hanging. But Gidris insisted, saying he had served the county faithfully for more than 20 years. He claimed the young prince had come to him for one reason, only to understand the county's debts. Calix acknowledged that he was the former chief treasurer, but mocked him, asking, "Are you sure about that?" He thought to himself that the man was a filthy, deceitful, cursed pig. Then he turned to the guard and asked if there was a torturer on site. He ordered him to be brought immediately. The prison chief rushed off like an obedient puppy. He believed Calix Shensen, being young and inexperienced, would be easy to manipulate, but he quickly realized he was wrong. That boy was, in truth, the real power in Seijensen County. Meanwhile, Gidris watched the situation and sensed that things were heading in a dangerous direction. Calix looked directly at the prisoner and asked how long he thought he could endure torture. Deep down, he hoped he would give it his best, and even sarcastically wished him good luck. Who knows, maybe that would move him enough to swap an execution for a slower death. Seeing Calix's expression, Gidris was certain the boy was serious. Desperate to save himself, Gidris said he had valuable information, things worth a lot of money. Calix thought he should have started with that. During the conversation, Gidris mentioned that if they handed over that estate to the royal family, they might no longer have to repay the debts. But Calix questioned, what if the debts had already been sold before his arrest? Maybe even to the Kosala family itself. Gidris fell silent for a moment. He hadn't considered that possibility. At that moment, the warden returned, bringing the torturer with him, who looked more like an executioner than anything else. Calix's eyes lit up with excitement. He seemed like the right man for the job. Desperate, Gidris begged for mercy. He revealed that there was a secret fund managed in the name of the Kosala family, and that this fund hid at least 100,000 gold coins. Calix looked into the hopeful eyes of the old treasurer, but completely ignored him. He let the torturer proceed with the work. Gidris then shouted that he had worked as treasurer for decades and knew what he was talking about. But that only sparked Calix's curiosity, who asked how he knew about the existence of that secret vault. Would it be necessary to tear out his fingers one by one to get the answer? Gidris confessed that he had once tried to rob the vault, not with his own hands, but by paying thieves to do it. Calix was surprised and said that, in that case, Gidris had funded a crime. He wanted to know how much had been paid. When Gidris said the amount started with a 3, Calix thought it might be something like 300 coins. But the answer was different. He had paid 3,000 gold coins. As soon as he heard that, Calix burst into laughter. The prison chief, however, thought that was the end for the treasurer. But Calix's laughter was out of disbelief. He remarked that 3,000 gold coins represented half of the county's annual revenue. He wanted to know where that money had come from. The answer was obvious. Gidris had taken it directly from the county's treasury. Cornered, Gidris said he had no other choice. He explained that the secret vault was protected by a magical orb. Calix, intrigued, asked him to explain properly. Gidris said he'd heard that it would take 2,500 gold coins to make a copy of the orb. And in the end, Calix concluded that the one who was tricked here was him. It was very likely that the thieves were working together with Gerard. Gidris, outraged, denied that possibility. He said he saw the vault entrance with his own eyes and saw Gerard open it using the magical orb. Calix then wanted to know where exactly this vault was. Gidris replied that it was on the Golda Plateau, but since he was taken there blindfolded, he didn't know the exact location. At that moment, Calix discreetly looked at the map inside his system. Everyone around wondered what he was looking at, since no one else could see that map. And there it was, a marker on the Golda Plateau, near a ruin. Kraut, analyzing the situation, realized it would be necessary to find someone who knew the region well. That's when he remembered Layla, one of the children trained as elite assassins. That specific group was trained in a camp located on the Golda Plateau. With that, Calix told the prison chief that he was leaving and that the torture could continue. Deep down, he felt that the pig of a treasurer deserved it all. He had stolen 3,000 gold coins from the county's treasury, and the more Calix thought about it, the angrier he got. He didn't want the prison chief to go unpunished either. But Gidris, he deserved something even worse. Calix then announced that they had just discovered Gidrus had stolen 3,000 gold coins. He looked at the prison chief and asked if he didn't know about that. The man, of course, denied everything. He thought Calix had no way of knowing he had accepted a bribe. But Calix said that before leaving, Gidris had said something interesting. He said he was a generous man, but that he was starting to wonder how long he could keep ignoring certain behaviors. It was a dilemma, and in that moment, the prison chief knelt, lowered his head to the ground, and begged for forgiveness. He pleaded for mercy, while silently cursing Gidris, who had betrayed him behind his back. He promised it would never happen again. Never again. But by the time the prison chief realized everything, Calix was already gone. In fact, that had been intentional. Calix wanted the prison chief to get angry and take out all his frustration on Gidris, intensifying the torture even more. But in that moment, an impressive presence appeared behind Calix. It was an imposing figure, who at first glance gave off a threatening aura, but upon turning, revealed an unexpectedly friendly expression. It was Kraut Salin, a county knight only 26 years old. A member of the Blue Lion Order, Kraut was already class 5, which was rare for someone his age. Calix, upon observing him more closely, was surprised by his skill. He had never heard of him, which meant he might have died too early in the original game. If he was already at this level now, he had the potential to become one of the continent's most powerful warriors. Besides that, having A-rank military skills was extremely rare. As he thought about it, Calix remembered a certain demon, a merciful-looking warrior who never left any enemy alive. No one, Not even the Shadow Prince knew his face. He was called the Herald of Death, but Calyx quickly dismissed that possibility. The Herald was known for his thin and gloomy appearance, while Kraut was muscular and had eyes far too innocent to match that figure. Even so, Calyx knew he didn't have enough information, and dwelling on it would be a waste of time. While he daydreamed, Kraut kept calling him insistently. He was there to report that a merchant named Gerard Musers was requesting an audience with the prince. The name immediately caught Calyx's attention. He already knew Gerard was involved in a plot with the treasurer. Later, during the meeting with the merchant, the man formally introduced himself as Gerard Musers, leader of a small trading company. Calyx remarked that even though it was small, the Musers company was considered solid, and competent merchants were always welcome. He wanted to know why someone of his caliber had come directly to the prince, since business matters were usually handled by Administrator Russell. Gerard replied that Baron Russell was only temporarily managing the county. The real owner was the prince, after all. Out of respect, he would never dare go against Calyx's decisions. The prince, however, answered naturally, saying he was just one of the two heirs and shouldn't be overestimated. Gerard, keeping his composure, praised his modesty and commented that everyone already knew the succession battle was over. That piqued Calyx's curiosity. He asked how Gerard knew something that had never been officially announced. Gerard apologized, explaining that, as an experienced merchant, he survived through his information network. He thought to himself that the prince was nothing like the rumors. People said Calyx was foolish, naive, and disconnected from the world, but the reality was different. He seemed cynical, intelligent, even cunning. At the same time, he was charming and beautiful. Gerard himself caught his mind wandering. This young prince was exactly his type. Calyx, noticing the old merchant's gaze, felt a chill run down his spine. That look had an unsettling energy. Irritated, he said that if Gerard had nothing important to say, he was leaving. The merchant, panicking, realized his plan was about to fail. He needed to say something, anything to keep Calyx there. He said he had gotten distracted by the prince's appearance and ended up losing control. Calyx, disturbed by the merchant's sly smile, ordered him to get to the point. That's when Gerard revealed the true reason for the audience. He wanted to discuss the massive debt that the late Count Kosherin had left with him. Calyx replied that he had never heard of such a thing, and found it strange that this matter was only now being brought up right when the treasurer and the prison chief were both imprisoned for suspected crimes. Gerard, confident, said it had been 5 years since the loan, and that Calyx might not be informed. He thought this was the moment he had long awaited, watching a beautiful young man fall into despair upon discovering an unpayable debt. To him, witnessing that scene would be an indescribable pleasure. He explained that, according to the contract, after 3 years he had the right to demand full repayment. Therefore, he requested that no later than 2 weeks after the month of sacrifice, in the imperial year 288, the full amount of 60,000 gold coins be paid. Kraut's reaction was immediate. He was deeply shocked by the amount. Calyx, on the other hand, found the knight's reaction strange. In Gerard's mind, Calyx's attempt to remain calm was nothing short of adorable. Still shaken, Kraut asked if there was any chance of extending the deadline. But that only disappointed Gerard, who realized the desperate one wasn't the prince, it was the knight. He explained that ever since the count's death, the county's credibility had plummeted. Personally, he would have demanded payment a year earlier, but had waited out of good faith. He believed Calyx would understand that gesture. Calyx, however, found it amusing that Gerard had shown up just 2 weeks before the deadline, pretending to be generous. He said he didn't know if Gerard was aware, but the county's annual revenue was over 6,000 gold coins. Getting a loan of 60,000 somewhere else wouldn't be an issue. That was something Gerard didn't need to worry about. Hearing that, Gerard pretended to be relieved, but internally thought it was typical of a naive young man. Still, he said he would return soon with the contract officially sealed by the county of Shigensen. Gerard believed that no one in their right mind would lend 60,000 gold coins to a naive boy like Calyx. He imagined he would soon see that noble on his knees, begging for help from a mere merchant. And when that happened, he planned to revel in the humiliation, maybe even turn that pretty little prince into his personal slave. With a disguised smile, he wished the boy good luck. Meanwhile, Kraut was desperate, trying to calculate how long it would take to gather all that money. Calyx, annoyed, told him to stop doing math and sit down, saying all the panic was making him dizzy. Still restless, Kraut asked if he wasn't worried, since failure to pay could result in losing the entire territory. But Calyx wasn't focused on that. He remembered that Gidris's vault was located on the Golda Plateau. Based on the system's marker, he believed the hideout was located in the ruins he had seen earlier. Outside the city, the continent of Aran was a hostile place, and the Golda Plateau was even worse, filled with tough monsters like Sasquatch. During the game, he had always avoided that region. Later, Calyx left. He was going to meet someone who knew the Golda Plateau well. His destination was the prison where a certain prisoner was held. Upon arrival, he noticed the place was much more decorated than he expected. The space had been adorned with flashy and expensive items, looking like a nouveau riche's home. Calyx commented sarcastically that the place was almost cozy. Lila casually replied that she had made a few adjustments. When Calyx asked if she was enjoying herself, she confirmed with sarcasm. Kraut, bothered by her attitude, asked her to behave in front of the prince, but when Layla looked into Calyx's eyes, she realized the truth. She had been tricked. She had never taken the puppet poison. It had all been a ruse. Calyx calmly acknowledged that she had figured it out faster than he expected. Layla said she knew he needed her, but made it clear she didn't intend to obey him. Maybe she'd change her mind if he was convincing enough, but he'd really have to be very convincing. Kraut was furious at her boldness and called her insolent. Calyx, however, said he was there to offer her a chance at survival. Even if she were released at that moment, she wouldn't last long. There was currently a deadly rivalry between the Essen and Kozala families, Lila confirmed. She was the one who turned Estella into a villain and destroyed Grambini's mana core. Calyx explained that she was the key witness, which made her the next target. The Kozala family would do everything to kill her. Besides, the mana core of Grambini wouldn't start working again just because she changed her testimony. The entire scheme set up for the Kozala family to swallow the county of Shunsin had been destroyed, and nobles would never let someone of inferior blood live after ruining their plans. Hearing that, Layla thought of all the hunting dogs she had seen, discarded by nobles after being used. She asked herself why she had to go through the same thing. Suddenly, with cold eyes, she grabbed an improvised weapon, a giant needle, and lunged at Calyx. But Kraut reacted immediately. He protected the prince and knocked her down with a kick, pushing her back. He shouted, asking how a vulgar assassin dared to attack the heir of a county. Calyx thanked him for the help, but told him not to belittle her. He said that, in the end, Layla had been essential for him to become the next lord. He explained that people often hate those who force them to see their own weaknesses. He asked if she knew why. Because it's easier. Taking your anger out on someone anyone brings momentary relief. But that's all at Island Momentary. He also said she didn't seem like the type to give up easily, and Layla agreed. She didn't plan on dying like that. She would survive. Calyx then smiled slightly. Finally, she had said something interesting. He promised that if she helped him with a mission, he would guarantee her safety from the Kozala family's hunters. And if she had family, he could ensure their protection as well. Layla, suspicious, asked if he was threatening her family. She wanted to know if he planned to use them as hostages. But Calyx just laughed. He told her not to fool herself. Even if she died, even if her family died, it wouldn't change a thing for him. Assassins like her were a dime a dozen. Layla didn't back down. She asked why, out of so many, he wanted her specifically for that mission. And Calyx replied that, before anything else, he would give her 1 minute. If Layla didn't accept the mission within that time, she would be free to leave. However, she knew she had no other choice. Everything Calyx had said was true. She herself had done the same thing many times, hunting down traitors to their last breath. Even if that prince irritated her deeply, she had no alternatives. So, she accepted the mission. At that point, Shunsin and Kozala had already passed the point of no return. The conflict between the two families was on the verge of exploding, and soon both might disappear. Calyx commented that, to him, the best-case scenario would be if the Kozala family seized control first. He believed that at least then, there might be a chance to negotiate. Nana, upon hearing that, reaffirmed her position. She said she wanted to be treated as a hired mercenary, not as a subordinate, and certainly not as a slave. She made it clear she would only follow orders within the scope of the mission. Calyx simply thought to himself, silently surprised by her boldness. Kraut, on the other hand, was outraged by her attitude. He found it unacceptable for anyone to speak to the prince that way. Layla then intervened, asking him to calm down. She assured him she knew how to show respect to someone who hired her, and that she was there to do her job for which she'd be paid. And she even asked if he intended to strike an ally. Kraut shot back, asking since when they were allies. At that moment, Kraut cut in again, reminding everyone that Layla had said something important earlier. She had mentioned that the Kozala family's shadow unit was trained at a secret camp on the Golda Plateau. That's when Calyx urgently requested that someone bring a map, a detailed one of the entire kingdom. Kraut responded that there was a large map in the war room at headquarters. Without wasting any time, Calyx ordered them to go there immediately. As everyone got ready, Layla watched the two moving at such a fast pace and wondered how they had so much energy. Even so, Calyx ended up lagging behind, which led Kraut to ask if he didn't know the way. The prince casually replied that he did, but since Kraut was the knight, he should take the lead. When the sun began to rise, they finally stood before one of the most valuable maps in all of Erin, an extremely precise, confidential military document. Calyx studied the map closely until he found the Golda Plateau region. Kraut explained that the territory was well known. There was a dispute over it between the Kosala family and the barony of Erebon. Both claimed the region as theirs. The area was rich, as it contained a high-quality copper mine. However, the constant conflict prevented any proper development. Calyx then asked if the barony of Erebon was one of their vassals, and followed by questioning the reliability of the map. He wanted to know when it had last been updated. Kraut admitted he didn't know exactly, but acknowledged the map was showing signs of wear. Layla, on the other hand, stated that even with the wear, not much had changed. She said she knew that area like the back of her hand, having played there since childhood. When asked what was on the Golda Plateau, she replied that there was indeed a place where adults forbade children from going. Calyx took the opportunity to ask how long the Kozala family had maintained its secret unit. Layla didn't know the exact date, but said she was part of the 6th generation of trainees and had been at the camp for 5 years, so she guessed everything started around 15 years ago. Kraut noted that the territorial conflict had also begun around 15 years ago. Layla then asked if he was starting to see the point. When he answered no, she simply said she expected as much. Kraut, irritated, called her insolent. Calyx continued, explaining that to train an army of that scale, a massive amount of resources would be needed. That meant it would be impossible to expand their forces so much without a consistent financial source behind it. Lila, curious, asked what that meant. Kraut answered that it meant someone was pouring a lot of money into the Kozala family. Calyx confirmed the theory, saying they had likely discovered a new source of wealth 15 years ago. That allowed allowed them to train the assassins they had today, including Layla. She then wanted to know what exactly that source was, and how it related to the ruins. Khalik explained that copper and silver mines were often found together, and copper itself often contained traces of silver. Kraut pointed out that secretly extracting silver was an extremely serious crime. Khalik agreed, saying that was the whole point. They concluded that the Kosala family had most likely found a silver mine within their own territory, but had kept it secret. By law, gold and silver mines belonged to the crown. Khalik commented that few nobles would have the courage to report such a discovery to the throne. That old ruin on the Golda Plateau would thus be the perfect hiding place to cover up such a mine. In the end, Khalik reflected that people might not believe him, since he had never left the castle. Still, he felt they were getting closer to the truth. Layla stayed silent for a moment, then asked what all of this had to do with her. She wanted to know if Khalik intended to declare war and seize the resource by force. Khalik explained that the county of Shenzhen didn't have enough military power for a direct war. Besides, since the mine wasn't officially declared, it was considered illegal. Even if they seized it by force, a single report to the crown would ruin everything. Their territory was on the brink of collapse, and they were in desperate need of resources. The plan was simple. All the money accumulated illegally over the years was likely stored in that location. Since it wasn't official wealth, they could steal it without risk after all. No one would admit they owned it. Later that same night, Russell approached Calyx and asked if he truly believed Kraut alone would be enough. The Golda Plateau wasn't an easy place. Everything had its time and place, and forcing a dangerous situation without necessity could lead to serious consequences. Calyx found the comment amusing and thought Russell sounded like a worried grandfather. He said that, of course, things would be safer if Russell went with them, but Kraut needed to grow. They could only move forward together if the night matured quickly. That was what the moment demanded. Even so, Calyx admitted that with the county in a fragile state, both of them leaving at once would be far too risky. Russell agreed, saying he had failed in his judgment, wished Calyx good luck, and asked him to take care of himself. He stated that if anything happened to the prince, Kraut would be held responsible. Kraut confidently replied that he would take good care of Calyx, but received a light knock on the head from Russell, who then turned to the knights, reminding them that the prince was still recovering. Even so, he had chosen to lead the mission to help the territory, and for that reason, everyone should serve him with loyalty. Calyx reflected that no soldier would respect a weak lord, and for that reason, strengthening the loyalty of those men was part of his duty as prince. Sometime later, they arrived at a deep, suspicious well. Kraut explained that from there, they would follow an underground tunnel to exit the castle's limits, although it would be a long distance. They proceeded cautiously, the knights, Layla, and Kraut. Further ahead, when they reached a trapdoor, Calyx struggled to open it. He thought that if he were alone, he never would have found it. He recognized that Kraut was good with that sort of thing. The knight helped him up, and Calyx asked where they were. Kraut explained they were inside an old abandoned watermill. He then asked his lord to get on the horse, but Calyx scolded him. He said he couldn't be called lord in a war zone. From now on, he should only be addressed as young master. Meanwhile, the soldiers were changing clothes to disguise themselves. Calyx noticed that even in merchant clothes, the disguise still looked strange and unnatural. They would have to act more convincingly if they wanted to pull it off. He then asked if Kraut had gotten what he requested. The knight confirmed, but asked if it was really necessary to use something that smelled that bad. Calyx said if he didn't want to wear it, he could put on the porter's outfit or even pretend to be a newlywed with Layla. Kraut, uncomfortable, immediately refused. He said he would play the role himself, as he couldn't allow Calyx to get too close to an assassin like her. The soldiers nearby gave him stern looks, and Calyx thought his knight always said unnecessary things though. Deep down, he wasn't wrong. Kraut then approached Layla and asked if he should go with his lady. She replied curtly, saying she didn't see any lady in front of her. Calyx watched the scene and reflected silently. That seemed to be the standard level of interaction between his subordinates. If they got along, it could lead to great synergy, but if they clashed, it could create factions and internal conflicts. That would be dangerous. In the end, someone would get hurt or abandon the group. This didn't feel like just a game. Maybe Hero's fate really was a creation of a god, imitating the real world. The ideal outcome would be for Layla to earn the trust of the others through her own merit. Maybe Calyx could help her discreetly, pulling a few strings. Soon after, Kraut announced everything was ready for the journey. Calyx agreed, saying they needed to get as far from the castle as possible before dawn. Even at night, the soldiers were excited. The group departed and began a long journey. They stopped a few times to rest, passed through villages, and continued without interruption. On the night of the second day, Kraut reported that the last rural village was behind them. Calyx ordered everyone to remove their disguises and begin preparations for real combat. At dawn, he declared that this was where the real work would begin. All the knights were ready, armored, and armed. Sometime later, Kraut noticed something strange. One of the squires reported that there was a group of large-footed creatures in the forest ahead. Kraut asked how many, and the squire replied that there were 5. Calyx then asked to be lifted to the top of a tree because he wanted to see for himself. Kraut, smiling, picked him up and carried him up. From there, Calyx saw the large feet. It was an entire tribe. He knew those creatures couldn't be underestimated. Kraut then said he had a plan to block their retreat using fire arrows. But Calyx was alarmed. He asked if Kraut really planned to set them on fire, thinking the plan was far too hasty. He believed no one on the continent knew monsters better than he did, but he knew he wouldn't be able to convince Kraut. The knight insisted that he would carry out the plan himself. Even so, Calyx thought that even if Kraut agreed, the other knights might not. Later, the group was discussing the strategy with the Blue Lion Order. Calyx, watching in silence, found it hard to even consider it a proper plan. He concluded that if he couldn't prove his own ability, he'd end up being just a dead weight on the mission. Lila, who had been quietly observing Calyx the whole time, calmly approached him. She said they needed to talk about something important. She declared bluntly that the plan was going to fail. In her view, the expedition members would be nearly completely wiped out. She asked if he truly intended to save them. Calyx confirmed that yes, that was exactly what he would do. She then wanted to know why he remained silent, as if he were hesitating. He replied that it wasn't hesitation. He was just trying to find a way to overcome the crisis without losing control over his subordinates. Layla then said she had an idea. She explained that the Bigfoots have a strong bond with their young. When battle breaks out, they prioritize protecting their offspring above all else. Regardless of the advantage or disadvantage in the fight, the females retreat with the children while the males go to the front lines. But once the young are hidden, a violent wave of vengeance begins. Calyx, who was already aware of that behavior, knew it wouldn't be easy to deal with. Still, he wanted to know what her plan was. Before answering, Layla said she wanted to confirm something. After all, the group's goal wasn't to exterminate the Bigfoots. She asked if it would be possible to sneak past them. Calyx replied that yes, it would be possible. Given that, she proposed a strategy to make the Bigfoots believe their hideout wasn't safe. At the moment, there were 5 of them blocking the main path. Once Kraut moved forward, they could organize another unit to cause a disturbance near the den, where the females and young were. Even if only for a short time, it would make them retreat to protect their own. If they took advantage of that opening quickly, they could pass right through. Calyx then asked who would be capable of finding that hideout. He knew that the Big Feet, when threatened, would lose control and go after anyone who threatened their young. It seemed like a suicidal plan, but Layla confidently said that she would do it herself. She had planned it from the beginning and was prepared. Calyx then asked if by any chance she had a nymph potion. Layla was surprised by the question and wanted to know how he knew that. He explained that she would never accept a truly suicidal mission. The only way to deceive the Big Feet was by using that special herb, so he deduced that she had it. She, in turn, said she had been watching Calyx for a while, and that he seemed completely different now. It was as if he had become another person. That made Calyx feel a little sick, but he admitted the plan wasn't bad. Lila reassured him, saying that place was almost like an amusement park for her. It was where she used to play the most when she was 8 years old. Calyx then wanted to know why she was willing to help him, even if it meant straying from the path she had been following. Lila replied that if House Shensen fell, she would also be in danger. Calyx acknowledged that and commented that it wouldn't be easy to gain the recognition of others either. He asked if she was really okay with that. Layla nodded, and Calyx said it was fine, but he still wanted to give one last piece of advice. He advised that, when dealing with the Big Feet, she should always assume there were at least 2 more than what was visible. As he began to say an old saying, Layla finished it, that those who go out hunting always come back and attack from behind. Calyx agreed with a smile, saying that was exactly how they acted. Then he asked what she thought about 2 suspicious locations. Lila responded confidently, saying there was indeed at least 1 Bigfoot in one of them, and that there was also a goblin colony nearby, one of the Big Feet's favorites. Calyx sincerely thanked her for the information. Now it seemed they could handle the situation with less risk. Even so, he thought it would be impossible to contain the Big Feet from the western side alone. They didn't have enough manpower, and trying to convince the creatures was too difficult. Deep down, he still had one more request to make. Meanwhile, Kraut, who had been watching their conversation from a distance, saw Lila with a smile on her face. She said that exchange seemed interesting. Before leaving, she approached Calyx as if she were going to kiss him, but just picked something out of his hair. Calyx froze for a moment. He felt like one of those otakus who risk their lives just to get an idol's autograph. An embarrassing and overly dramatic moment for what he was actually experiencing. Right after, Kraut approached, curious, and wanted to know what exactly had just happened there. Calyx, still a bit embarrassed, remembered he needed to ask Kraut to prepare Layla's equipment, as she would carry out a special mission. Kraut was bothered and asked what mission it was, making it clear he didn't trust her much. Calyx replied that in this case, it was better to trust only his judgment. The princes, after all, they were all in the same boat. Even Layla was surprised by the firmness in his words. Kraut then gave in, and said he would prepare the equipment, but only this time. However, Lila took off her hood and said it wasn't necessary. When she did that, she revealed a slightly tight outfit, which made all the soldiers blush. It wasn't exactly revealing, but tight enough to draw attention. Even Kraut turned completely red. Layla said she didn't need any special gear, as she was already ready. Before leaving, she spread that strong and unpleasant smell all over her body necessary to fool the Big Feet. The odor was so intense that it made Kraut's nose twist. He thought that woman was truly brave, or at least very bold. With her blades drawn, Layla moved forward, determined. She didn't care about the chaos around her. She thought worrying was useless and announced that it was time to put the plan into action. Calyx suggested she take some soldiers, just in case she needed backup, but Layla refused. She said it wouldn't help, as they wouldn't obey her. Given that, Calyx left the mission in her hands, and soon Layla departed. Meanwhile, Kraut was preparing to lead the other front of the expedition, along with the Knights of the Blue Lion Order. As the group approached the Big Feet, Kraut thought he needed to end the fight with a single blow. Calyx, observing from a distance, felt tense, worried about what might happen. When Kraut struck the first Bigfoot, his blow was superficial and barely scratched the creature. This made Calyx question why he had slashed instead of thrusting. The Bigfoot retaliated forcefully, but Kraut, being an experienced knight, managed to block the attack. For Calyx, witnessing that fight up close was impressive. It was completely different from the battles he knew only from the computer screen. The creature, enraged, pounded its own chest and called the other Big Feet. At that moment, Calyx even considered whether it would be better to burn down the whole forest, but he quickly discarded the idea. Kraut, on the other hand, didn't retreat. He charged forward with the Order's knights and, gathering all his mana, concentrated it into his blade. Then he used a powerful technique called Pale Thunder. The explosion was so intense it cracked the ground around them. When the smoke cleared, Kraut looked proudly at the fallen enemy. Calyx, however, was bothered by his attitude. He thought Kraut was being too full of himself when there was still a lot to do. After all, while he was celebrating, the other soldiers were struggling. One of them had been grabbed and almost killed, but Kraut arrived just in time to save him with a precise kick and ordered the soldier to pull himself together. With no time to rest, Kraut had to run to save another comrade, tearing off the arm of one of the monsters. But he was already getting tired. He ran from one side to the other, trying to protect everyone, and muttered that it seemed endless. Even the older Big Feet were much stronger than he expected. Finally, he found an opening and struck the heel of one of the larger creatures. Despite his fatigue, Kraut felt that something was wrong. At first, they had identified 8 Big Feet, but now, only 7 could be seen. One of them had disappeared. That's when he saw it. The missing creature was an albino Bigfoot, with an imposing appearance, charging straight toward the prince. Exhausted, Kraut ran as fast as he could, but one of the soldiers had already jumped in front of Calyx, trying to protect him. Without hesitation, Kraut launched a powerful skill at the monster. When the dust settled, the soldier asked if they had managed to kill it. But no, he had been struck so hard that he was thrown to the other side of the forest. Even Calyx, seeing it, felt a chill. The danger was real. Kraut shouted for Calyx to stay by his side. The knight's magical and aura-based attacks held the enemy back for a moment, but it was clear that wouldn't last. Calyx then ordered Kraut to go deal with the monster directly. If they continued like this, they would be completely wiped out. At that point, it became clear that the knight wasn't Kraut, but Thomas, who had also been assigned to protect the prince. Everyone was exhausted and beginning to get confused in the chaos. To be fair, they did look quite alike, especially on the battlefield. Thomas hesitated. He had received orders from Kraut to stay with the prince, but now it was Calyx himself giving the order to go fight. As a knight, his duty was to obey the prince. Meanwhile, Calyx ran to where the soldier had been thrown. He needed to stabilize him before it was too late. He found the man wounded, blood flowing under his armor. He quickly removed the metal plates and applied a potion. Seeing the man's swollen stomach, he realized it was serious. There was internal bleeding, and a low-grade potion like that wouldn't be enough. Calyx knew he needed to find a healing mage as soon as possible. The wounded soldier, Albu, was in critical condition. Before leaving, the prince knelt beside him and asked him to hang on a little longer, to stay alive until he came back. Running back into the forest, Calyx confirmed with his own eyes what Layla had said. There really was a goblin camp nearby. It was clear now, that was the true hunting ground of the Big Feet. Fear began to take over. He thought he might die there, alone in that wild place. Still, the plan was perfect. Layla had probably prepared a trap, and it should work, but the fear was still very real. He thought that, unlike in a game, there was no just sitting in front of a monitor, dying and starting over. There, if he died, it was the end. Even so, he had no choice. Gathering his courage, Calyx ran straight toward the Bigfoot, who was about to attack him. At that moment, the trap Layla had prepared was triggered. Another creature approached, but Calyx, dodging, activated the second trap, a net of thorny vines that tightly restrained the creature. He recognized it as an AE web, which could be combined with Triton potion on the thorns. It was something simple but extremely effective. Layla used that mixture to mask her own scent, but Triton also had anesthetic properties. The Bigfoot was paralyzed, and Calyx took the opportunity to drive the blade directly into the creature's head. The sensation made him nauseous. Feeling the metal pierce the skull, the weight of the blood and death before him, was disgusting. He never imagined he would commit murder. And yet there he was, taking lives with his own hands. He thought he had fought against a Class 4 knight before, but now he was killing with traps and a knife. But those weren't the only enemies on the field. A goblin charged at him, and Albu, even gravely wounded, threw himself in front of the prince to protect him. The blow was fatal. Albu died there, defending his lord. Calyx felt his rage rising. He beat the goblin with fury, even without the strength to face it properly. He thought he hadn't been hit by that small dagger only because the goblin's arms were too short. His body was still weak, and he could barely wield a sword properly. However, he had the advantage of reach. As long as the creature didn't get too close, there was still a chance. When the goblin came again, Calyx tried to strike back, but his blow was off. The creature passed by him with ease, forcing him to dodge in a panic. Terror overtook his senses, but with a lucky move, he kicked the goblin's weapon away and managed to pin it against a tree. The body dropped before him, lifeless. Seeing it, the blood, his ragged breathing, Calyx threw up. It was an instinctive reaction. This wasn't like games. It was real. He truly thought he was going to die there. Then, a system window appeared before his eyes. It informed him that he had overwhelmingly defeated a Class D monster using traps, poisons, and other resources, which would slightly reduce his rewards. He had also defeated a Class F monster, the Goblin. Since it was his first real battle, he would receive bonus rewards. He leveled up from level 8 to level 11 and unlocked an inventory as an additional prize. Soon after, Kraut reappeared on the battlefield. Seeing the scene, he asked in shock what had happened and whether the prince was injured. Calyx, still catching his breath, said he was fine and wanted to know how things were on the other front. Kraut explained that luckily, after killing 2 of the big feet, the others retreated. They said they were lucky, but Calyx knew luck had nothing to do with it. That had been the result of Layla's plan, a well-executed plan. The prince then asked about the soldier he had left behind. Kraut wanted to confirm if he meant Albu, and hearing the name, Calyx felt guilty. He thought he had been naive enough to believe that no one would die in that plan. He knelt before Albu's body and apologized for not being more careful. Kraut tried to comfort him, saying it wasn't his fault. Albu died with honor, but Calyx replied that there's no such thing as an honorable death. Death is just death. For Kraut, it was understandable. It was the first time Calyx had lost a subordinate. The feeling was inevitable. Looking around, Calyx saw other bodies, 3 dead soldiers and 1 wounded. Considering the circumstances, he recognized that the damage had actually been light. Even so, he felt like he had failed. If he had used his knowledge from the beginning, no one would have died. He had only survived because of Layla's traps and Albu's sacrifice. Finally, he asked what they did with the bodies of soldiers who died in combat. Kraut explained that, when the situation allowed, they recovered the bodies and brought them back. Calyx gave the order, and Kraut turned to relay the instructions to the soldiers. However, when he looked at them, he saw that they were all crying, visibly moved. Those hardened warriors, marked by battles, had been deeply touched. They sincerely swore to protect Lord Calyx with their own lives, without hesitation. Kraut noticed something had changed in their expressions. For the first time, it seemed they had all truly accepted the young lord from the heart. Calyx had finally earned the full loyalty of his soldiers. Sometime later, Kraut reported that the bodies had been treated with preservation potions, and the preparations were complete. Everyone was waiting for Lord Calyx's signal to depart. He also noticed that the looks directed at him were different. Those soldiers, who once saw him as just another noble, now showed respect and hope. Even so, Kraut battled with guilt. He felt it wasn't the time to mourn, but rather to inspire others and move forward, offering hope for the future. Calyx gathered the men and praised them for the victories against the Big Feet. He said that from that point on, they would march with determination toward their next destination. Those still healthy would take care of the wounded, because no one would be left behind. Abandoning a comrade was not part of that army's values. While all this was happening, about an hour earlier, Lila was deep within Bigfoot territory. During the mission, she was nearly discovered by one of them, who spotted her among the foliage. Still, she managed to improvise a trap with ropes while moving quickly between branches. Using her heels to gain momentum, she activated the mechanism at just the right moment. When the Bigfoot bit the bait, it was immediately strangled by the trap that closed around its neck. The creature was still alive and, even restrained, reacted violently, grabbing the tree with force. Layla, however, was quick and managed to dodge. She ran to reinforce the rope made from monster tendons, which made it extremely durable. Even as the creature thrashed, the trap held, though the tree itself threatened to collapse from the strain. Sensing the danger, Lila knew she would have to inject the Triton potion directly into the monster's bloodstream. Getting close was risky, but she had no alternative. With agility, she dodged another attack and stabbed the syringe into the creature's back. She told herself she had succeeded, but still questioned whether it would actually work. For now, she could only trust. Moments later, the Bigfoot broke the trap by toppling the tree. However, before it could react, it collapsed unconscious. Layla saw this as confirmation that the plan had worked. She didn't want to admit it, but she had to acknowledge that Prince Calyx was smarter than he seemed. Still, she couldn't ignore how much he had changed in such a short time. She had spent an entire year observing him up close, and now he seemed like a different person. Maybe, she thought, that wasn't such a bad thing. For a while, she had believed she would never be able to carry out her revenge. But now, maybe. Why not? Later, Kraut was walking with a mixed group of soldiers, some healthy, others severely wounded. He said they needed to rest, and they soon decided to stop. The men were exhausted. To everyone's surprise, Calyx appeared, bringing healing potions for the entire group. The soldiers were speechless, as those potions were rare and valuable items. Kraut couldn't help but ask what the prince was doing. Calyx answered simply, saying that was exactly the problem. Kraut explained that those potions had been prepared by Viscount Russell, especially for Calyx. They were precious items, reserved for critical situations. Even so, the prince questioned whether he should just stand by and watch his soldiers suffer. Kraut tried to argue, but Calyx told him not to worry. After this expedition, he promised everyone would drink potions like they were water. Kraut sincerely hoped that would be true. At that moment, when Calyx turned around, he was surprised by an emotional scene. All the knights of the Blue Lion Order were kneeling in reverence. Kraut understood the meaning. A man is willing to die for another when he recognizes his worth. At that moment, he was certain that his men had finally found a lord worthy of following. Calyx, seeing Kraut smiling, asked why. But before the march resumed, a system window opened before his eyes. The support rate, which had previously been 14%, had now risen to 18%. That alone was enough to make him genuinely happy. happy. With a sincere smile, he resumed the journey. The next morning, Calyx abruptly stopped the march. He firmly stated that the secret vault was right there. Crowd found it strange. There was nothing in the area, no entrance, no guards, no sign of any structure. He asked if the prince had met with Layla, but Calyx said not yet. With no other option, they decided to set up camp exactly at the indicated point. Later, with the camp ready, Calyx shared his suspicion. He believed the secret vault belonging to Viscount Kosheran's family was buried in that specific location. The spot Calyx indicated was a bit far from the camp. Kraut disagreed, saying it was more than just a bit. If the map was correct, the journey would take at least a week. Up to that point, the soldiers had endured an extremely grueling march, sustained only by willpower. Kraut warned that many of them would likely give up if they had to ride for another 7 days. Thomas also spoke up, reminding everyone that if they stayed put for too long, they might be found by the enemy. That's when Calyx got everyone's attention. He pointed to the spot marked as the secret vault, but clarified that he never said they would get there by traveling on the surface. Everyone had thought that was the expedition's goal, and Kraut asked if that wasn't the final objective. Calyx confirmed that it was, but explained that the real entrance was exactly where they stood inside the tent. As he stepped on the ground, a secret passage opened beneath his feet. He seemed pleased with the result. However, before he could descend, the soldiers stopped him. They were worried about their lord being the first to enter that dark tunnel. Calyx suggested they could go first, but he doubted there was any danger. Even so, Kraut found it strange how much Calyx seemed to know about that vault, and asked how he had access to so much information. Calyx, trying to keep things light, replied that he followed Dr. Fran on all social media. He knew he wasn't exactly someone trustworthy until now, having shown only weakness and confusion from the start, so he wasn't surprised that they still doubted him. Kraut explained that that wasn't exactly what he meant. Thomas, however, confidently stated that he believed in his prince. He explained that if a leader truly values even the humblest soldier, then everyone will believe the cause is just. His words touched the other soldiers, who made it clear they were on Calyx's side. Even so, Calyx reflected that he was still weak. He didn't know how to use mana, had no great skills, and yet those people were entrusting him with their lives. Thomas, however, reminded him that strength is not just physical. The teachings of knighthood made it clear that true strength comes from within. Kraut was moved to tears. He was deeply touched and proud of his companions. Faced with this, Calyx said they couldn't waste any more time. They had to continue the mission, as there were still wounded out there depending on them. The Vanguard Knights descended first, since they didn't know what they would find underground. Meanwhile, Calyx wondered where Layla might be, hoping that Turu was safe by her side. Elsewhere in the forest, Layla had just taken down another Bigfoot using the antidote she had prepared. She decided it was time to cause more chaos now with fire. By spreading smoke, she drew the attention of other Big Feet, who began gathering around the fire. But she knew the real problem was still to come. Other assassins were nearby, observing everything. Layla knew they always appeared when chaos broke out. She thought she was ready to show what happens to those who turn their backs on a real assassin. Meanwhile, one of the assassins was carefully recording the scene. For him, this was an emergency. Not a single bone fragment remained, not even bodies. That could only mean someone had cleaned the area, which indicated the Big Feet had been driven away. He thought he needed to inform Viscount Selvios immediately. Watching discreetly, Layla noticed the scouts sealing collection bags, a technique they used to send reports. She identified the wind direction and quickly splattered blood on a nearby tree, staining it with the scent. The Big Feet began gathering in that area. One of them, an albino, detected the scent and led the others that way. Later, that same scout was running in desperation. His group had been completely wiped out. He thought he had shaken off the enemy, but was killed by a direct strike from Layla's blade. As his body fell, she simply thought that she needed to warn the prince as soon as possible. She would leave the body there for the next Bigfoot to find. Meanwhile, underground, Calyx and one of the soldiers were trying to solve the puzzle of the vault's entrance. Even with the magical protections weakened by time, it wasn't something a common mage from the Viscount's territory could break easily. Calyx then asked who the ruling Viscount of that land was, and Thomas answered that it was Marquis Antonio. During their exploration, they found gemstones, crystals used in magical experiments, and some herbs. Kraut reported that there were also enchanted artifacts, like accessories, but nothing of great value. Calyx, however, believed something more important must be hidden there. That's when he found another path, possibly leading to a secret passage. Kraut, suspicious, followed the prince, scolding him for his impulsiveness. He said the investigation wasn't finished and that Calyx could get hurt. Even so, Calyx pressed forward, searching for something specific on the walls. He was almost certain there was a hidden switch. He was right. The doors opened, revealing a concealed space. Before them appeared a screen functioning like a hologram. Kraut found it strange. He said he had searched the entire area and never saw a room like that. Calyx explained that this place was what was called a false ruin. In the past, it was common for mages to hide their real laboratories or tombs inside fake structures to fool looters. Most invaders would settle for any visible treasure. Kraut realized that meant they were now standing inside the true chamber of House Kosheran. Calyx confirmed. That was the expedition's final destination. He had seen this scene in the game before, before, but knew that to open the next door, one needed to clearly visualize the desired function. He tried to focus, aiming at the crystal orb in front of him, but Kraut kept talking in his ear, ruining his concentration. Even so, after insisting, Calyx managed to issue the correct mental command. The next door opened, revealing the path to the true ruins hidden beneath the surface. All that was left now was to go to the false ruins, retrieve the silver that Gerard had hidden, and bring it back. It sounded simple. Operating the control device, Calyx was able to view multiple locations at once. After examining the false ruins in detail, which Gerard used as a hideout, he found a door he had never seen before. It was the entrance to an ancient silver mine. Kraut commented that this must have been the method they used to mine in secret. He never imagined they'd choose something so well hidden. Calyx observed that there was no sign of human activity nearby. It looked like operations only took place at specific times. Kraut added that if the miners had actually returned safely, rumors would have already spread. They had likely been killed. Faced with this, Calyx declared that he wouldn't let that happen again. To ensure it, he said he would deactivate the crystal orb's key, changing the system's security codes and connection settings. He also planned to leave a small parting gift. The way he spoke began to scare Kraut, who decided to back off and check the rest of the perimeter. Now, alone, Calyx pressed a hidden button, one he knew well from the game, but seeing it in the real world was completely different. The artifact before him was the pristine bracelet of revelation. Its effect was powerful. If the wearer received a fatal wound, it would automatically activate a defensive barrier that protected them for 2 hours. If during that time another fatal blow was dealt or no treatment was given, the wearer would die. The ability could only be used again after 7 days and would stop functioning entirely after 3 activations. For someone like him, who still had little combat power, it was the ideal artifact, like having 3 extra lives. But what caught his attention was a glowing black inscription engraved on the artifact. It was in a language he didn't know. Even so, he could recognize some words. One of the names written there was Recatoria, a legendary figure, the goddess said to have taught humans the magic system. Calyx had never seen a scene like that in the game, which made him think that maybe such an experience was only possible because he was truly inside the world. When he touched the inscriptions, he was immediately pulled into absolute darkness. Everything around him vanished until, in an instant, he found himself floating in an astral plane. There, before him, were beings that looked divine. Information began to flood his mind all at once, causing unbearable pain. He heard not with his ears, but with his body vibrations running through his bones. The gods were debating. One of the divine figures stood out for her compassion toward humans. Because of that, the others scolded her, saying that if she wanted so badly to be like mortals, then she should stop being a goddess. That harmony among them was disturbing, and in the next instant, the goddess was burned before his eyes. Calyx understood that this figure was Recatoria, who, for showing compassion to humans, had been demoted. She ceased to be a goddess, fell to the status of a demigoddess, and from then on, would be despised by both the gods and the very humans she once loved. Her end would be lonely and miserable. Soon after, Calyx returned to reality, gasping, trying to understand what had just happened. Then, a system message appeared before him. He had absorbed a fragment of the first authority of Recatoria. As a reward, he received a special ability called Penatello, the feather dagger of the fallen goddess. This ability strengthened a melee weapon, unlocking the user's latent potential and dealing area damage to nearby enemies, proportional to his maximum level. Additionally, the strike was unavoidable and could not be dodged. However, there was a cost. Each use reduced Calyx's maximum level by 10%. He realized he was dealing with something extremely rare. Common abilities were ranked from F to S, but there were exceptions. Unique abilities and authorities, which could only be used by individuals classified as class 10 or higher, the so-called demigods. Developing one's own authority was the only way to reach that level. Authority represented one's true identity in that world. Then another system message appeared. For having absorbed a fragment of authority, Calyx's maximum level increased from 37 to 43, and his current level rose from 11 to 18. Calyx no longer had doubts. The one who had sent him to that world was Recatoria. If he wanted to hurt a god, he would need an authority-level ability. Perhaps, in the end, his mission was to avenge Recatoria in her own name. As strange as it seemed, the prince was starting to enjoy it. He wondered if that was the real ultimate goal of the game. He didn't like being manipulated, but that didn't matter. He would finish this game no matter what. Then Kraut appeared with news. He asked the prince not to be alarmed, as they had collected a huge amount of precious metals, gold, silver, copper, all organized into 6 large chests full of gold coins, totaling around 30,000. It was more than Calyx expected. In addition, there were 420 chests filled with silver bars, with an estimated value of 100,000 gold coins. But transporting all of it with just the strength of the expedition would be practically impossible. Calyx realized they had so much gold that it was becoming a problem. Even so, he felt relieved when he remembered he had a special function, the inventory. It was time to test it with the chests. He asked Kraut to bring everything to him. When all the chests were stacked in front of the prince, he ordered the group to begin begin preparations for the return journey. Kraut, confused, wondered what they would do with that mountain of chests. Calix, aware that the concept of skills or players did not exist in that world, decided not to explain. No one there would understand what an inventory was. For all practical purposes, it was better to make something up. He said everything was fine, and revealed that he had obtained a subspatial bracelet, a high-level artifact with enough space to store all of it. Kraut, surprised, asked where he had gotten such an artifact, but Calix preferred to keep it secret. Kraut simply nodded and went to stand guard outside. Alone, Calix got to work. He focused on the objects before him, causing a status window to appear. By thinking about the inventory in that state, he could store items automatically, or even drag them manually. With that, he stored all the chests at once. Now, he felt like there was nothing to worry about anymore. With that wallet full, he lacked nothing. It was time to return. When he went up, the soldiers were already ready to leave, but Calix noticed Layla was missing. He asked about her, and Kraut replied that she hadn't returned yet. He questioned if she had betrayed the group and run away. He also said he had never trusted her. Calix, however, didn't believe it was a coincidence. It was too strange that the Bigfoots had retreated at just that moment. After explaining his reasoning, he heard from Kraut that attacking the hideout alone was a suicide mission. Even though he didn't have a good relationship with Lila, he didn't want her to die. Calix said he had wanted to use another method, but a certain someone had dismissed his suggestion. Kraut reflected and remembered that, at the time, he thought the alternative plan was too dangerous. In the end, the prince had been right. Since Lila hadn't returned, it was clear that something had happened. Thanks to her, the group had avoided many losses. Now it was their turn to repay the favor. Calix asked the knights if that wasn't true. Though reluctant, Kraut said they would obey whatever the Lord commanded. He thought that even though he felt like a burden on the expedition, as a knight, he would fulfill his duty. Calix ordered Kraut himself to form a separate squad. The rest should remain in safety. Later, while reflecting, the prince considered two possibilities. Either Layla had been captured by the former Bigfoot leader, or by the pursuers of the organization she once belonged to. Even so, he questioned whether the pursuers knew they were in that place. After all, Lila herself had assured him she erased all traces. She wouldn't be careless. When Kraut approached again, he asked what they would do next. Calix replied that they would go after the Bigfoot leader. They intended to take revenge on him. He ordered herbs to be boiled in oil, and the weapons to be dipped in the mixture. It was time to act. He believed Layla was still waiting for them. With the squad hidden in the forest thickets, Calix explained that the hideout likely housed only females and children at that moment. The males were probably out, either chasing Lila or hunting food. The group was to eliminate whoever was inside. That would force the males to return quickly to the territory. Kraut then asked if the plan was actually to track the males who were after Lila. He wanted to know if that would really work, since, as everyone knew, they weren't easy enemies. But Calix was confident that the poison they had prepared would be effective. They invaded the Bigfoot's cave and eliminated all the enemies along the way. Later, the males began approaching at full speed. Calix ordered the group to hide, while he, Kraut, and Thomas set out to find Layla. The prince believed she wouldn't fall to weak enemies. They followed the footprints to find her. During the pursuit, Thomas asked if the prince liked Lila, since she was beautiful, but Calix quickly denied it and told him to focus on the mission. Still, Thomas confessed he hadn't expected her to take part in such a dangerous mission. The prince knew Layla had also realized that everyone needed her. She could have become famous as a celebrity on Earth, but she didn't care about that. Maybe it was due to the urgency of the situation and the need to survive. Calix remembered that the first major event on that continent in the game was the invasion of the Jaipur kingdom, and during that time, the faction that would play a decisive role was the Mountain Rangers. Before, he thought they were just volunteer soldiers, but now he considered the possibility that powerful groups, like Viscount Selvios's, were raising those soldiers for a greater purpose. Meanwhile, Kraut and the other soldiers had defeated the Bigfoots. The poison had been extremely effective. They won without any injuries. After the battle, they immediately set out to help their lord. Kraut felt a deep respect for him. Deep down, he hoped everything would turn out well. When Kraut and Thomas arrived at the location, they found Lila badly injured, surrounded by wolves. Thomas didn't hesitate, eliminating the creatures with brutal precision. Calix ran to her with a healing potion. The wound was deep, but after a quick treatment, Layla managed to survive. The prince believed the wound would heal slowly as long as she kept taking the potion. Thomas helped Calix administer the dose, and slowly, the color returned to her skin. At that exact moment, Kraut arrived with the other soldiers. In the end, everything worked out. All was well when it ends well. A week later, at Count Shensen's castle, Calix was focused on strengthening his body. His current level was 18. Considering that the average combat level of a healthy adult man was around 20, and he was only 15 years old, his progress was remarkable. Russell and Kraut were watching the training. Russell commented that even with little practice, Calix's physical endurance had improved a lot. It was as if he had been gifted with a naturally strong body. Kraut, on the other hand, joked that he looked completely different from before the mission, maybe even using some secret enhancement. But Calix just thought that his journey to level up was only beginning. Kraut asked when he would resume sword training, but Russell insisted that his body's recovery was still the priority. When Calix finished the training, he informed them that he needed to take care of some matters at the local branch of the Magic Tower. He ordered preparations for the visit that same day. After he left, Russell commented to Kraut that the young master trusted him a lot. Kraut replied that, to be honest, he still didn't fully understand who that boy really was. But there was one thing he couldn't deny. Calyx was so talented that he couldn't even imagine the limits of his abilities. Moreover, he genuinely cared about his subordinates and the people under his protection. For that reason, Kraut believed he couldn't let unnecessary doubts get in the way of their lord's work. Russell admitted that at first, he was only there to watch over him, but now, he could barely keep up with Calyx's thoughts and decisions. Still, Kraut noted that Calyx still needed a master to guide him. He lacked authority. Russell reminded him that Calyx was still just 15 years old. To earn his title, he would need to complete the coming-of-age ceremony and reach Class 4. Kraut commented that since his progress was stable, that probably wouldn't take long. Russell recalled how worried he had been after Count Kosharin's death, fearing the territory would fall into uncertainty. But he never imagined someone so fit would emerge so soon. The son of a lion is also a lion. Later, at the branch of the magic tower in Jensen's territory, a mage welcomed them with surprise and enthusiasm. She commented that she was in the presence of a charming boy and a handsome, muscular man. She didn't know who they were, but said handsome men were always welcome. She used magic to serve tea. The teapot and cups floated delicately to the table, and Calyx noticed she even heated the tea with magic. Analyzing her stats, he was impressed. Why would a Class C mage be managing such an isolated branch? Before him stood Rosin, 32 years old, a member of the White Magic Tower and the person in charge of that branch. Calyx was surprised by her poise and elegance. She noticed the curious look in his eyes and asked what was impressing him so much. He replied that honestly, he didn't expect to meet someone like her in such a remote region. He commented that her gestures were extremely refined. Kraut, noticing the tone of praise, wondered if that woman was the young master's type. He thought Calyx seemed a bit too excited. Still observing, Calyx said that if she could heat a teapot with a single touch, then her skills must be at least Class 5, and reaching that level before the age of 20 was nearly impossible unless she was a direct disciple of the main tower. Rosin was flustered by the compliments. When Kraut made a comment, Calyx responded with a light pinch to his waist. Rosin laughed, saying that although she looked young, she was already over 30. Calyx commented that she looked great for her age and asked what her secret was. She replied simply, saying she slept well and washed her face often. After a long, lighthearted conversation, Rosin finally asked what had brought them there that day. Calyx explained that he actually wanted to buy explosion scrolls. She laughed, saying he was a valuable customer. The price for 30 scrolls was 600 gold coins, but since he was so handsome, she'd do it for 500. Calyx figured he had saved at least 100 gold coins. Rosin, smiling, told him not to worry. Even if the branch was in decline, the authority of a branch director was still the same anywhere in the magical world. But Calyx had one more request, a bit more delicate. He said he would like to request a loan from the reserve bank. Rosin asked for the exact amount. He replied that he needed 60,000 gold coins. She turned serious and explained that she couldn't just use the branch's entire fund as she pleased. Calyx said he understood. In exchange, he would leave gold and silver coins as collateral. Since it was a loan, he would also pay interest. He thought that if he used the coins stolen from Gerard's secret vault, it would be the same as admitting he was the thief. There was no other place where he could get that amount except here. He needed that loan, no matter the cost. Rosin apologized, saying the request really was excessive. She believed the supervisor would reject the proposal immediately. But there was a way. Since central oversight didn't reach that region, they could keep the agreement just between them. As long as Calyx paid within 6 months, she would have no problem with it. However, if the deadline was exceeded, all the gold and silver left as collateral would be sold immediately. For Calyx, that was exactly what he had planned. Mages always needed resources for research, and Rosin was certainly eager to collect interest on that amount. He thanked her for understanding. Rosin smiled, saying she already expected the two of them would get along well. For Calyx, this meant his debt to Gerard was finally settled. Meanwhile, at his merchant company, Gerard was furious. One of the patrols guarding the secret vault had disappeared. Walking the mountain trail to the vault's entrance took more than a day, but there was a direct route that could be done in just a few hours. He was certain who was responsible, and sent all his men immediately to the Golda Plateau. However, on the way, they were intercepted by a golem. The assassins accompanying him were not intimidated, but they should have been. The creature's first strike took down 2 of them at once, and the rest, despite trying to resist, were also crushed. Everyone was being wiped out. In the end, only Gerard and a few knights survived. The leader of the knights commented that he'd heard golems didn't appear naturally. The mage in the group confirmed it. To summon and control a golem like that, it would require at least a Class 5 mage. That meant the enemy was nearby. The situation was getting worse, and the leader warned that the damage was escalating fast. It might be time to retreat. But Gerard refused. He said he wouldn't turn back. The tribute to the Marquis had to be delivered within 3 days. If they didn't clear the path within 24 hours, they would all die there. Meanwhile, back at the tower, Calyx wondered if Gerard had already received his gift. Rosin lightly asked what kind of gift that was. Was it something for a girlfriend? She even said she would love to receive something from him too. Near the tower, Layla was also reflecting alone. When she saw the interaction, she became irritated and wondered if that witch witch was trying to seduce her lord. Kraut, returning with Layla, reported that all the luggage had been properly placed inside the magic tower. Calyx thanked him for the good work and, as planned, left a gift with the mage. When Lila returned, she wanted to know why the prince was dealing with such a strange mage. Kraut, however, thought it best not to say anything unnecessary. Upon seeing the gift, Rosin was delighted. She said it was beautiful, wonderful. Calyx explained that it was just a gesture of gratitude for the preparation funds she had been providing. He had obtained that artifact through magical tracking and never imagined he would use it in that way. Rosin, in a more serious tone, reminded him that he had promised not to tell anyone. As he probably knew, if they were to carry out an official transaction of that scale, they would have to deal with a mountain of bureaucracy. For Calyx, that was just an excuse. She simply wanted to keep the interest for herself and not report anything to the central tower. Calyx said he would keep that in mind and that he would continue counting on Rosin. She replied that business like that was always welcome and, excited, said he had broken the record for scroll sales. Even so, she wanted to know why he needed so many explosion scrolls. He realized that her position as a branch chief wasn't for nothing. Rosin was great at extracting information without sounding aggressive. Thinking of that, he answered casually, saying it wasn't for war or anything dangerous. He had just restocked what they used during the mine excavation. That was all. Rosin found it odd. She asked if he had really used the scrolls just to dig holes. She wanted to know if he had found a gold mine. Calyx replied that he'd tell her everything on the next visit, especially since, from now on, the two of them would be seeing each other often. Rosin smiled and said she looked forward to it. At that moment, Calyx had 600 checks in hand, each worth 100 gold coins. With that, he believed the territory's massive debt was finally resolved. Everything was paid off. To him, that symbolized more than just money. It felt like he was freeing himself from the past. The old Gerard, who had tried to assassinate him with a cold and impersonal order, was now just a weed on the roadside, a failed enemy. But revenge was not yet complete. He would make them all pay, even if they never saw it coming. Meanwhile, Gerard's men were still trying to kill the golem that had ambushed them. Using chains, they managed to immobilize it and expose its core. When they finally destroyed it, they discovered that more than 60% of the team had been wiped out during the battle. The Knight Commander reported the critical situation, but Gerard didn't care about the losses. He demanded the vault gates be opened immediately. However, when he tried to open it with the magic orb, the system rejected his authorization. Access was considered invalid, and the countermeasure protocol was activated. The vault began a self-destruction countdown. Gerard tried again and again, but nothing worked. The mage with him insisted they leave before it was too late. But it was too late. The security program had activated its first phase, a defense system that automatically summoned monsters. Now, the group was in even greater danger. Later, during the carriage ride, Lila expressed her jealousy toward the mage from the tower. Even so, Calyx wanted to talk about something else. He asked what she thought would happen if he betrayed Viscount Selvios. Layla was startled by the question. She said that Selvios was an extremely strict man, a perfectionist who didn't forgive mistakes. He was the type of person who didn't tolerate failures from his subordinates. So Calyx asked whether, in that case, Gerard would meekly accept his death if the Viscount ordered it. Layla replied that if Gerard found out his secret funds had been stolen, he would do anything to survive. He wouldn't hesitate to betray Selvios if necessary. And realizing the direction of the conversation, she understood that her lord was once again planning everything on his own. Calyx, for his part, felt like he was still missing something. It seemed there was an important part of the plan he had yet to see. The next morning, on the Golda Plateau, Gerard's Knight Commander reported that, thanks to the support of a general, they had managed to exterminate the monsters. However, Selvios' secret forces had been almost completely wiped out. Even so, Gerard insisted on continuing. He said they would create a new shadow force and now only needed to open that damn door. With no other options, he decided to use magical explosion scrolls to open an alternate path. But as soon as he entered, he had a terrible feeling, and he was right. All the silver had vanished. He immediately ordered everyone to search. What the knights found, however, were only more explosion scrolls scattered on the ground. As they tried to understand what was happening, a final trap was activated. Everyone there was killed instantly, and the cave collapsed, burying the rest. Gerard felt that this was the end. If things continued like that, he too would be executed by Selvios. He called his trusted knight and said it was time to activate the emergency plan. Then, he approached the mage, thanked him for everything he had done, only to kill him without hesitation. He said the mage wasn't to blame, but to keep the secret, he had no choice but to eliminate him. One of the remaining members of the Shadow Force said the Knight Commander wouldn't stay silent after something like that. But Gerard replied that he had probably already been swallowed up by everything that had happened. All they could do now was follow the emergency plan. When Gerard returned to Viscount Selvios' estate, he found the man already aware of everything that had happened. The Viscount received him coldly, and Gerard, kneeling, begged for forgiveness. However, Viscount Selvios didn't want to hear empty apologies. What mattered to him were results. He asked directly what had happened to all the silver silver Gerard had stored. Gerard explained that he believed they had been targeted by tomb raiders. According to him, during the looting, they had probably triggered the security system by accident, which made the situation worse. Even so, he claimed that most of the silver coins were still there. He added that few thieves would be capable of carrying more than a few crates through those narrow underground passages. Trying to regain control, Gerard revealed that he had secretly offered a reward to merchants dealing in precious metals, hoping to locate the culprits. His plan was to set up an ambush. After all, silver coins couldn't be transported that easily. Still, Viscount Selvios was unmoved. He stood up and declared that once the culprits returned, they would be captured and pressured until every stolen coin was returned. Then, the Viscount took a whip and decided to punish him right then and there. He began insulting Gerard and lashing him violently across the back, leaving his skin raw and bleeding. He made it clear that Gerard's petty conflicts meant nothing to him. However, if such behavior threatened the greater cause, then it became a problem. Viscount Selvios then announced that Gerard would be removed from the shadow forces. From that moment on, he could only act again with direct authorization. The bigger issue, however, was that the gold tribute was already being sent to Marquis Antonio, and they had to cover that amount. He ordered that the territory of Shenzhen be informed about the start of the formal confiscation process. Any amount they offered would be used to make up for what was missing in the tribute. If that wasn't enough, there would be no choice but to sell the assets of Gerard's trading group. Feeling wronged, Gerard cursed the situation in silence. All the fortune he had earned through his work was now at risk. Even after saying all that, Viscount Selvios made it clear he still hadn't forgiven him. He ordered Gerard to find the stolen silver. If he failed, he knew exactly what awaited him. Gerard simply replied yes, accepting his master's command. He left the room wounded, and shortly afterward, a subordinate treated his injuries with a potion and covered his bloodied back. Once inside the carriage, Gerard, still seething, complained about the desert people, revealing his racist views. He said he didn't like dark-skinned people but would have to tolerate them for now. Then he asked his subordinate about the preparations. The man replied that everything would be ready in 3 days, but the executives would not be easy to handle. Gerard commented that more than half of the Shadow Squad had died or been injured, and the rest had scattered. That's why he believed this was the best chance to act. His plan was to invade the Count's estate and take everything of value they could find. After that, they would flee with the money. However, the subordinate wasn't so confident. He thought Calyx had quickly ended the succession dispute and wondered if it would really be that easy to steal from someone like him. A few days later, in the territory of Shenzhen, Kraut reported that Gerard had shown up to address the debt. Russell, in turn, said the visit was exactly what the prince had predicted. He asked Kraut to accompany the prince to the meeting, as now he needed to show leadership. He also said he couldn't let his own frustration interfere with the prince's authority. They had to do everything they could to support him. As soon as he saw the prince, Gerard tried to begin by complimenting his appearance, saying he looked stronger. But Calyx, impatient, cut him off and asked him to get straight to the point. Gerard's flattery was testing his patience. Gerard then explained that the confiscation process had officially begun. The territory of Shenzhen had been declared unable to pay the 60,000 gold, so they were authorized to seize any valuable assets. If they refused, an official would be appointed to monitor the region and prevent any escape attempts. They would also establish surveillance. Kraut, outraged, showed his anger, but Gerard tried to stay calm, saying there was no need for violence. He stated that in situations like that, judgment was crucial to recover funds, and that threats would only make things worse. Klex then argued that if judgment was really that important, there must certainly be room to postpone the payment. As expected, Gerard responded that it was a good point, especially coming from someone as sharp as the prince. He admitted that the conditions could indeed change a little. It was at that moment that Calyx realized the true reason for the visit. Gerard was desperate for money. He wanted the payment at any cost. And, as ironic as it seemed, Calyx felt he would end up paying that debt not out of obligation, but because in some way he wanted to. Calyx calmly said that he had already secured the money. He added that there was no need for Gerard to keep trying so hard to prove his sincerity. At that, Gerard couldn't hide his surprise, and asked how he had managed to gather so much money. Calyx, still calm, simply replied that it was good news, and saw no reason for such astonishment. Right after that, Calyx presented several capital bonds from the Magic Tower. All were authentic, totaling exactly 60,000 gold coins. Gerard checked them and confirmed that the documents were real. He couldn't understand how Calyx had acquired all of that, but immediately considered taking the bonds and fleeing. Since they were light and easy to carry, they could serve as a means to escape execution. However, Calyx wasn't done. He added that they had also found the silver. He revealed he had 32 bars in 420 crates. Upon hearing that, Gerard realized Calyx was clearly admitting to having been responsible for stealing the silver bars. At that moment, Gerard was sure that Calyx already knew about his plan to escape with the money. If he reported everything to Viscount Selvios, it would be the end for Gerard. Calyx then mentioned that when the rumors began to spread, Viscount Selvios himself had fled with his secret funds. He asked Gerard what he thought would happen to him now. He said Gerard only had two choices: either admit that his fund had been stolen and accept punishment, or betray betray the Viscount and flee. From Gerard's reaction, Calix was certain that this was exactly his plan. Calix then offered to help Gerard survive and escape. He asked if he was going to take that rare opportunity. Gerard replied that escaping the territory wouldn't be enough. Calix then assured him that he would prepare solid support, strong enough that no one could touch him. Still suspicious, Gerard said he would need even stronger backing than the prince himself. Calix agreed, but made it clear there would be a price. If he signed, he would have all that. In fact, the contract obligated Gerard to officially declare that the county of Shenzhen had settled all its debts. As he signed, Gerard couldn't hide his astonishment. He thought Calix was truly terrifying. That boy had fooled everyone all along, and now he himself had fallen into the trap. He thought he should never have made the prince his enemy. Calix was too much for even someone like Gerard to handle. After signing, he asked Calix what they would do from that point on. The prince replied that he would head to the capital soon. Meanwhile, Gerard left with his subordinate, escorted by guards. Later, Kraut asked if Calix had foreseen all of that. The prince replied that the most important thing was gaining support, and the most influential person they could turn to was His Majesty's firstborn, Prince Gale. Kraut grew concerned and asked if that was really safe. After all, they were giving up the shield they once relied on. Calix, however, stated that their support remained the same. He said that for 60,000 gold, they had made a great deal. He believed it was worth much more than just money. Even if Kraut didn't understand at the moment, he would in the future. That same night, Viscount Selvios's chief of staff arrived with urgent news. All the top executives of the Myrtas company had vanished, and the company's main assets had been sold. Shortly after, another subordinate reported that Myrtas's headquarters had been stormed by debt collectors, causing massive chaos. He also said that several men from the Golda Plateau fortress had disappeared, while others were found dead that morning. Even with all that, Viscount Selvios remained silent, increasing the tension in the air. Moments later, the chief of the knights entered the room and reported that even those who used to show dissatisfaction had joined the movement and fled. The Viscount then asked where they were. The knight replied that they ended up in the county of Shenzhen. There, a week ago, the count's security forces had raided Gerard's hideout. Everyone had been imprisoned in the underground dungeon. However, upon inspection, Gerard was not found. It was confirmed that he was no longer there, and due to the strained relations with Shenzhen, the trackers could not follow any trail. Viscount Selvios, suspicious, wondered why Gerard would go to Shenzhen, as he wasn't foolish enough to do that on his own. He concluded that he had been deceived. He then ordered the chief of staff to immediately send someone to the fortress on the Golda Plateau. They needed to ensure that the mine's secret was safe. The chief of staff reported that, according to the information, the mine had collapsed and was buried under debris. But Viscount Selvios insisted. He said that precisely for that reason, someone had to go there and check personally. Even if they had to dig, they had to confirm whether the silver was still there or not. Finally, the leader of the night squad was instructed to bring back all the trackers infiltrated in Shenzhen's territory. If their identities were discovered, the damage would be even greater. He asked whether they should end the tracking operations. Viscount Selvios said he believed the situation was exactly as they feared, and ordered that a boat be sent to monitor the Aran River. If no one showed up within 2 weeks, the envoys were to return. If those involved were still within the kingdom and hadn't escaped, there might still be a chance to settle accounts in the future. He ordered all the chiefs to prepare, as they would soon meet with Marquis Antonio. Later, at Marquis Antonio's castle, the Marquis commented that even perfectionists like the Viscount fail from time to time. Viscount Selvios replied that it wasn't a big deal, but admitted that the foundations he had built had collapsed. Marquis Antonio remarked that things hadn't been going well since the incident. Perhaps they had acted too hastily. Viscount Selvios, however, said that this was a good opportunity to eliminate the promising Count of Shenzhen, who was about to reach S-class. If someone like him supported the king, it could shake the entire political balance. Marquis Antonio said that even if they regretted it now, there was no turning back. The authorities would certainly catch whoever stole the money. However, he questioned what to do about the arrogant Count of Shenzhen, who had helped in the escape. He asked if they shouldn't fabricate a reason and declare war on the territory. But Viscount Selvios had something else in mind. For him, the best solution was political pressure. He said he had verified that the Shenzhen family had not yet replaced their representative in the Council of Nobles, and Orsel Tigrim still held that position. They planned to use him before a replacement was appointed. Marquis Antonio liked the idea and wanted to hear the details. Meanwhile, Calix had already anticipated this kind of move. He knew that Viscount Selvios would likely try to use diplomatic means, and that by now he had probably discovered Gerard's betrayal. Kraut commented that, out of revenge, they would opt for diplomacy instead of war. Calix agreed. He said that war was extremely expensive, and political pressure was more viable at that moment. Kraut then asked if Calix already knew what strategy they would use. The prince explained that lords rarely left their castles unless it was for war. Even when far from their territories, they could still take part in the political arena of the capital by appointing a delegate to represent their interests. Crouch noted that this was exactly why the Council of Nobles existed, and asked if they had already sent a representative. Calix confirmed and asked who the current representative of the the county was. Kraut replied that it was Orsul Tigrum, but also knew he was Estella's closest aide, which made the situation extremely serious. They urgently needed to replace him. Despite everything, Calyx remained calm. In fact, he had already anticipated everything and prepared his own plans. Calyx said it was always better to keep enemies closer than allies. He explained that if opponents felt too confident, they would end up desperate when struck by an unexpected blow. At that moment, the royal capital of Eusenia was introduced, a city with more than 500 years of history and the center of the Hork Kingdom. With a population of approximately 250,000 people, it was an extremely populous city. At its center stood the royal castle, where King Clivio Carco resided. That morning, the king opened the session and asked what the first topic of the day would be. They replied that it concerned the succession of the county of Shenzhen. The king lamented the death of Count Koshirin, calling it a great loss, and asked who would take over the county. The representative present was none other than Orsul Tigrum, who clearly did not support the legitimate heir. The king asked him to explain the situation. Orsul, who was in collusion with Marquis Antonio, claimed the county was in great turmoil, which was causing anxiety and distress among the people. He said that the firstborn, Calyx Shenshin, had taken power using military force, falsely accusing the widow Estella of murder, and had even imprisoned and sealed the manticore of his own half-brother. The king found the situation odd and asked whether it was true that Calyx was considered unstable. Orsul responded that Calyx had attempted suicide, though unsuccessfully, and suggested there might be mental or physical issues involved. The king, however, didn't believe that Count Kosharin's sudden death had been natural. He noted that the county had been taken over by Calyx, a member of the aristocratic faction of the family, and suspected they were trying to seize the title by force. However, the king said he liked Calyx. He added that if Calyx had really taken power by force, he must at least have had the support of local knights or the territory's people. He asked Orsul whether he was suggesting that everyone in the territory was crazy. Pressured, Orsul admitted it was hard to say. Marquis Antonio then intervened, saying that even so, falsely accusing someone of murder and sealing a brother's mana were extremely serious actions. He demanded that Prince Calyx be summoned to the capital to have his physical and mental health evaluated. The king acknowledged that the House of Lords was not trustworthy, but agreed for now to the summons. However, he decided that the investigation would be conducted exclusively by the Palace Administration Department. The House of Lords could send only one witness. Later, in a private conversation, Marquis Antonio told Viscount Selvios that the situation had become a major problem. King Clivio seemed to be protecting Calyx, which indicated some dissatisfaction with the fact that the county of Zhensin had fallen under direct influence of the Lord faction. For Viscount Selvios, however, this wasn't a difficult problem to solve. He said Calyx just had to become the king's son-in-law. Marquis Antonio, surprised, asked if he really wanted the boy to marry the daughter of an old king on the verge of death. But the Viscount replied that there was no need to waste such a valuable card on the current king. He said the king he referred to was the next one, perhaps in 5 or 10 years. The Marquis understood what he was suggesting, and unsettled, asked if the Viscount was talking about replacing the king. Meanwhile, in the territory of Shenzhen, the royal decree finally arrived several days later. Calyx already had a good idea of what it was about. Thomas informed him that he had been reported to the Palace Administration Department and would have to respond to the charges. He explained that the prince would need to clarify whether he had suffered any mental, spiritual, or physical damage when he attempted suicide. Calyx, with irony, summarized that they wanted to know if he was crazy. He said there was no reason to respond to such nonsense and ordered Russell to come up with an excuse so he wouldn't have to go to the capital. Kraut was alarmed and asked if he really intended to directly disobey a royal order. Calyx then questioned whether it had truly been a royal summons. He saw no reason to rush, especially because the contents of the decree questioned his sanity. To him, it was obvious that Viscount Selvios already knew he had only been following royal orders, and now they were just waiting for him to arrive so they could kill him. If he died, the lords would achieve their goal. Thomas, outraged, asked how they dared to plan the assassination of a direct descendant of the great family. Crouch stood up and said he would risk his life to prevent that from happening. But Calyx replied calmly, saying there was no need. He didn't intend to go personally. He would just send someone as a messenger. Kraut then asked if he was talking about Gerard. About 2 weeks later, in the capital of Eusenia, Marquis Antonio remarked that the count had still not shown up. He believed Calyx was planning something. King Clivio sarcastically asked what kind of plan that might be, and showed little interest. The Marquis insisted, saying Calyx had hastily destroyed the manicore of a legitimate heir without evidence, and now that it was time for retribution, he was probably afraid. The king asked what should be done about it. Marquis Antonio offered to visit the territory personally and investigate the situation. The king then formally thanked him, saying he was deeply grateful for the Marquis' efforts. However, the king's butler grew worried. He could see that the king was dangerously approaching his political rivals. Despite that, the king moved straight to the next topic of the meeting, and was surprised by what he saw in the report. The new topic concerned the engagement of His Highness, the fifth prince. The news shocked everyone, including Duke Ottomer. The king said he had heard that Marquis Antonio's daughter was beautiful and intelligent, and decided that the engagement could be arranged. Marquis Antonio, of course, considered it a great honor for his family. Many in the assembly began to suspect that the king and the Marquis had conspired together. Duke Ottomer, uncomfortable, reminded everyone that it was customary for members of the royal family to choose their brides from among the ladies in direct service to the king or queen women, trained for years with exceptional skills. But for the Marquis, everything was going according to plan. He was sure no one had expected such a move. The king then asked if the Duke was implying that the Marquis's daughter was inferior. Ottomor responded carefully, saying only that she had not followed the traditional procedures. The king firmly stated that royal marriages were decisions made by the king and queen, and nobles like him had no right to interfere. The Duke thought the king was technically right, but realized there was more behind that maneuver. In fact, the moralist faction, to which the Duke belonged, supported the first prince. However, the fifth prince, CL, was the queen's biological son. Everything now indicated that the king intended to name him as his successor. The moralist faction was completely ignored until the moment the first prince himself entered the throne room, saying he needed to speak to the king urgently. Clivio, the king, said he had not been invited and ordered him to leave immediately. The first prince refused, saying he would not leave until he was heard. The king then asked if he was defying his authority and disobeying a direct order. The prince replied that it was all just a misunderstanding. Gale had no intention of getting involved in CL's marriage or the internal affairs of the county, but he had found important information on a completely different matter, and believed both the king and the assembly needed to be informed. Therefore, he apologized for any inconvenience and presented his report. In response, the king asked what the matter was about. Gale explained that he had received a letter sent by Russell from the county of Shenzhen. The king, however, believed that issue had already been resolved and didn't understand why it was being brought up again. Still, Ottomor insisted, saying there were unresolved matters in the case of Shenzhen and that it was concerning that no messenger had returned in response to the royal summons issued by His Majesty. Ottomor also pointed out that Marquis Antonio had been appointed to lead the investigation, and even so, no progress had been made. At that moment, Marquis Antonio himself questioned whether they didn't trust his word. Ottomor replied that, as one of the parties involved, it was unfair for him to act as mediator. Impartiality was essential. Marquis Antonio then raised doubts about Russell, asking how they could trust someone like him. What if Russell had a close relationship with Prince Calyx, who, after all, was the real suspect in that story? Even so, he realized that Ottomor's plan was working. Ottomor responded that Russell Nigel was the former leader of the Blue Lions, an honorable swordsman known for his strong sense of justice and chivalry. He was someone who would never tolerate injustice and, for his merits, had received the Royal Order of Honor. Therefore, any report sent by him should be considered trustworthy. Realizing this, Marquis Antonio understood he had fallen into a trap. Ottomor emphasized that they were in a country of knights and asked whether the king didn't trust his own administration. King Clivio, with a certain indifference, said he didn't care much about such details but tried to soften the situation, saying that Marquis Antonio probably hadn't meant any harm by raising doubts. Marquis Antonio, trying to defend himself, said it wasn't a matter of distrusting Lord Russell. At this point, Ottomor suggested they read the content of the letter, and the king agreed. He asked the first prince to read it aloud. Gale then began reading. He declared that it was true there had been an attempted assassination in the house where they were staying. Prince Grambini, trying to avoid execution by hanging, had voluntarily sealed his own mana. All punishments had been carried out in the name of Russell Nigel, who was acting as the official representative of the county. All knights involved had unanimously agreed with the decision. For this reason, the report had been submitted to the House of Nobles. Marquis Souvenir, approaching to verify the signature on the letter, confirmed its authenticity. He had served alongside Russell in the Royal Guard and could easily recognize his handwriting. Known as the Sword of the Kingdom, Souvenir was a proud knight, and Russell was one of the few he acknowledged as a true free knight. He said there was no doubt the letter was genuine, and called Marquis Antonio's suspicion of Russell Nigel unforgivable. At that moment, Marquis Antonio realized he was in serious trouble. His original plan was to weaken the moralist faction, but ironically, he ended up strengthening it even more. Gale became the center of attention, and the balance of power within the court was shaken. A new battle for succession had begun. Trying to justify himself, Marquis Antonio said he hadn't meant to cast suspicion on Knight Russell, but that the accusation against Prince Grambini was based solely on the testimony of an assassin, someone without credibility. Ottomor, however, found it pointless to keep arguing with him. Even so, Ottomor stated that leaving the title of Count vacant indefinitely was not an option. Marquis Antonio, in turn, argued that Prince Calyx was only 15 years old and, according to rumors, didn't even have the skills to become a knight. He believed that the bare minimum was for him to be a swordmaster. Ottomor, surprised, asked if that was a joke. A swordmaster at 15? Marquis Antonio had barely reached that level at 50. It was absurd. Still, Marquis Antonio insisted that Prince Calyx needed at least to show capability as a mana user, as that would prove his potential to assume the position. Ottomor calmly assessed the situation. He knew Calyx was still only 15 and, at best, would take 3 to 4 more years to reach Class 4 as a mana user. That was too long. At least for now, there were no signs of imminent war, and the marriage also seemed likely to be delayed. Deep down, that was a positive outcome for the moralist faction. Faced with this, King Clivio agreed. He said that would be the final decision. The Assembly of Nobles would form a special investigative team to continue monitoring the case. If conclusive evidence surfaced, a new disciplinary action would be decided in a morning session like that one. However, the process would have a time limit. The team would remain active only until Count Calix became a mana user. If he was already at that level, the team would be dissolved immediately. Marquis Antonio said he had no objections. Internally, he thought Autumor didn't truly know Calix. To him, the boy was just a fool. There was no way someone like that had reached Class 4. He also believed that the king's decision had been extremely favorable to him and his allies. He had always looked down on the territory of Shigensen, and now everyone there would be punished. Later that same night, Marquis Antonio decided his intelligence team should take control of the situation. He gave direct orders to a subordinate, without Viscount Selvios knowing anything. The subordinate replied that Selvios wouldn't notice, especially if everything was buried among piles of paperwork. Marquis Antonio agreed and said he'd leave the task in his hands, even if it meant making Calix suffer. The man remarked that the Marquis seemed even crueler than last time, and the Marquis simply ordered him to use one of the Dark Knights, as they had done before. It was better to handle such things without getting his own hands dirty. Meanwhile, at the castle of the first Prince Gale, Gerard was present and was warmly thanked by him. Gale said the intervention had happened at the perfect moment. Just as His Majesty had distanced himself from the moralist faction, Gerard had appeared to reunite the group. No one else could have orchestrated such an unusual plan. But Gerard knew that the real author of the plan wasn't him, it was Calix. Still, he wondered how the boy could know so much. Even so, he didn't hesitate to take the credit. He needed to prove his worth, no matter the cost. Gale mentioned that Viscount Selvios was on Marquis Antonio's side, and both were probably just waiting for the right moment. But Gerard warned him not to underestimate what they were capable of. A well-calculated move could ruin everything. Unfortunately, the fifth prince's engagement had not yet been called off. Gerard asked if there was anything they could do about it, but Gale said royal marriages followed the will of the king, which prevented them from interfering directly. Gerard then said that Gale would likely become the next target. Gale agreed, but Gerard assured him he didn't need to worry. He said Gale had escaped the darkness and was now the very son of the moralist faction. From now on, he should strengthen ties with nobles, loyal to the royal family, and guide them like a beacon. Gale replied that it sounded wonderful, and declared he also wanted to bring the territory of Shenzhen into his faction. Gerard thought it might not be a bad idea. Lord Russell was a symbol of integrity, but he also believed there was no need to offer too many rewards to the territory. He said you shouldn't feed the fish after you've caught them. Gale then reminded him that he was the one who delivered Russell's letter, suggesting he might have a deeper connection with Shenzhen. But Gerard insisted it had just been a misunderstanding. He had only helped deliver the letter, nothing more than a simple transaction. Even so, when Gale looked into Gerard's eyes, he felt a slight chill. That man's gaze was just like Calix's, as if it could see into someone's soul. Gale then said he would immediately depart for the territory of Shigensen, and asked Gerard to prepare a statement of support. Surprised, Gerard asked if he was really going in person, but the prince said he didn't mind being rejected. Just the act of going there would be enough for the local nobles to imagine the political consequences of his visit. For Gerard, this was terrible news. He wanted Gale to depend on him, not Calix, but there was nothing he could do. He simply lowered his head and obeyed. A few days later, Russell stormed in, slamming the table. He said Calix needed to reach Class 4 as a mana user as soon as possible. But Russell then said that becoming strong didn't require much thinking. The best path was to take one step at a time, and he would personally make sure Calix became powerful. Calix, however, was terrified. He tried to ask him to calm down and wait, but it didn't work. Later, he was practically being tortured. The guards were afraid, the knights felt pity, and the boy was lying on the ground, bruised, swollen, completely beaten. He thought that at this rate, he would end up dead. The next morning, Russell woke him again. It was time for more training. Calix, exhausted, said he had no talent for that. He felt like he was going to die like that. Russell, in turn, said that talent wasn't necessary to master the sword. Anyone who trained with dedication could reach Class C, and he himself was living proof of that. Calix then asked if that kind of training wasn't harmful to the body. He was completely destroyed, but Russell replied that those injuries could be healed with a basic level potion. Calix argued that he needed to save money, but Russell reassured him, saying the territory's finances were healthy thanks to him. Besides, he had rested enough. It was time to train. Later, there was Calix again, ready to be beaten. This time, he managed to see the strike coming, and tried to react fast enough to block it, but failed. He even joked that the sky must have been watching him that day. Despite everything, he knew he had to get out of that situation as soon as possible. Any solution would do. He thought and remembered a woman, the strongest ally of the first prince, one of the most skilled characters in the game when it came to money. The problem was that, at this point in the story, she and the prince hadn't met yet. Calix thought silently. If that woman hadn't met the prince yet, maybe he could reach her first. It was a chance to bring her to his side. Meanwhile, Russell was picking him up from the ground again for another round of training, but Calix interrupted, saying he had something important to say. Russell, suspicious, warned that if it was just another excuse to avoid training, the punishment would be 10 times worse. Even so, Calix insisted. He said Russell needed to know about the silver bars valued at 100,000 gold coins. They were valuable, but had been stuck due to being stolen goods. They couldn't sell them directly, so they needed an intermediary to help launder the money. Russell, still skeptical, thought it was just another excuse to avoid training. He asked if Calix really needed to deal with that at that very moment, but Calix responded firmly. He said that if they loaned those bars to someone trustworthy, the interest alone would yield 200,000 gold coins. Every idle day was a loss. He commented that Russell didn't seem to understand the magic of compound interest, interest over interest, and that it was urgent to bring order to the county's financial mess. When Russell asked how long it would take, Calix said he would need to spend 3 months in the capital. The two stared at each other in silence. In the end, Russell accepted and said he would inform Kraut, who would take over as substitute in the county during Calix's absence. Calix tried to argue that such formality wasn't necessary, but Russell insisted it was. However, the next morning, Calix received alarming news. The first prince was on his way to the county. Kraut explained that in the last assembly, a large-scale succession dispute had begun between the first and fifth princes. Everything pointed to Gale coming to claim the territory. Calix panicked. He said he hadn't heard anything about this, begged for the carriage to be prepared immediately, and said he had to leave, but Kraut reminded him he didn't even know how to ride a horse yet. Calix, determined, replied that he'd learn on the way. He said he'd go ahead, and the others should follow afterward. As he ran, he thought to himself that, although he had never seen the first prince in person, every Destiny of Heroes player knew his name well. Gale, of House Lackville, 29 years old, a member of the royal family, first prince, and a natural strategist. His stats were impressive, level 6 in combat, with 39% popular support. His administrative skill was ranked B, finances at C, but his military performance was rated SSS. Diplomacy was A, and kingdom development was also A. Calix concluded that Gale was known for gathering talented people around him. The risk was clear. He himself, Calix, could be a target. He ordered Kraut to stop talking and get ready immediately. Kraut, meanwhile, was already imagining the scolding he'd get from Russell for letting the young master leave alone, and of course he wouldn't let that happen. 2 hours later, Calix was impatient. He yelled for Kraut and Russell to hurry, and asked where Layla was. She too was getting ready to leave. Thanks to the prince's efforts, the pursuers had been nearly neutralized. The power of the Shadow Group had been severely reduced, and many deserters like her were now free. But Layla still didn't know where to go. She had once dreamed of this freedom, but now her mind was blank. She would simply go wherever the wind took her. Calix, however, suggested she consider going to the Holy Empire of Granada, known for training women in mana manipulation. Lila asked if that was true, and Calix said she could believe it or not, it was her choice. Still, she thanked him. If fate allowed it, they would meet again. Calix felt sorry to see her go, but he knew he couldn't and didn't need to stop her. Layla wasn't a legendary warrior or someone with exceptional talent. She was just someone trying to find her own path. They said goodbye, and Calix thought that, if there was a chance, their paths would cross again. Later, Calix went to Albo's grave, the young soldier who died protecting his life. Honorably, he gave his life for him. Still, Calix hadn't stopped Layla from leaving, just because her status showed a low level. Maybe he was still treating people like characters in a game, but he promised himself that next time, he would try to act more human. Soon after, the Blue Lion Knights were ready, waiting for Calix, who was also prepared to depart. 3 days later, at the border of Shinsen's territory, Russell and his entourage met First Prince Gale. That night, everyone attended a banquet. Of course, Russell expressed deep thanks for the hospitality and respect, but Gale quickly noticed that the new successor of the territory was absent. With a slight tone of critique, he remarked that he had expected to meet Calix there. Russell promptly apologized, explaining that the messenger had arrived in the territory only a few days after Calix had departed, so he hadn't been informed in time. Gale accepted the explanation. He briefly wondered what reason Calix might have had for leaving the territory, but since he had no information beyond Russell's vague response, he chose not to push further. Asking again might seem too intrusive. He merely commented that it was a pity, as he had wanted to meet him. Still, Gale made a point to say it wasn't personal. He stated that he was very interested in meeting Russell, and that it was an honor to be there. With time, the conversation went straight to the point. Gale wanted the support of Shinsen's territory. He declared this directly. He knew that reconciliation with Viscount Koshirin was out of the question, and there was no more reason to pretend neutrality. He commented that perhaps the territory's representatives already assumed they were allied, since he himself had delivered Russell's letter at the assembly. Russell thanked him again politely, maintaining a calm and respectful demeanor. Gale then shifted the topic slightly and asked, with apparent curiosity, how exactly they had come to know Gerard. Russell reacted with surprise and returned the question. Didn't the prince already know that? Gale replied that yes, he had already heard the explanation, but wanted to hear Russell's version. There was something in the way he told stories that intrigued him. In truth, what bothered Gale most about Russell was how hard it was to understand his true intentions. It was as if Russell had no openings, always calm, discreet, impossible to read. Even though he never lied, he also never showed his emotions. He seemed impenetrable. Russell then explained that when they received the royal summons, Prince Calix was ill. They had sent a message explaining they would be delayed, but the content of the letter hadn't been properly transmitted. Gale asked if that meant there was a problem with the official messenger. Russell confirmed. He said the messenger was on horseback when he accidentally tripped and broke his ankle. In the meantime, Gerard showed up with an unexpected offer. He wanted to escape Viscount Selvios's influence and, in exchange, promised to pay off all the territory's debts. According to Russell, all of that had happened completely unexpectedly. Not even he had anticipated the situation. It was just a series of events beyond his control. Gale, hearing that, thought the story was, in a way, even plausible. It didn't seem like a lie, and Russell, as a respected knight, was known for his integrity. But But at the same time, Gale reflected that that was all. Russell was an honest man, but he didn't possess extraordinary political or military talents. If Gerard had decided to flee, and Russell had just been caught up in it, then there was nothing to question for now. Russell, on behalf of the entire territory of Shigensen, formally declared support for Prince Gale Roche. In addition, if allowed, they also made a request directly to the prince. To better understand this situation, we need to go back 3 days. At that time, Calyx had already predicted that Prince Gale would likely ask for their support. There was no chance of reaching the 5th prince, Chiel, so Russell commented that, since Marco Antonio was Chiel's stepfather and guardian, it would be complicated to enter into direct conflict. Calyx stated that even if they supported the 1st Prince Gale, they wouldn't gain much in return. Still, there was no other choice. If they chose to offer support, they needed to take a firm stance from the beginning. That was when Calyx asked Russell to request a transit tax exemption for the guilds operating within the territory. Russell explained that currently, there were no functioning guilds. All had been dissolved due to financial difficulties. But Calyx already knew that. Even so, he said they couldn't leave the situation like that forever. Despite that, the entire country was already divided between 2 major factions. Even though Gale was the 1st prince, his influence didn't reach the territories loyal to the 5th prince. Therefore, it would be enough for the exemption to apply only in the regions where Gale had influence. As for the number of artifacts allowed, Calyx suggested limiting it to 1,000 per year. That way, Gale might be more willing to accept. Russell commented that the number was still very low, since even with transit exemption, each territory still had to pay separate taxes to the central government. But Calyx insisted that he ask exactly as explained, assuring him it would work. Back to the present, the 1st Prince Gale stated that Russell could feel free to make any request. If it was within his power, he would fulfill it. Russell realized at that moment that everything was unfolding exactly as the young master had planned. The next day, Calyx was completely exhausted. Kraut commented that they were almost at Poznu, about an hour away. But Calyx complained that he could no longer feel his own body from so much horseback riding. Kraut retorted that it was his fault for never practicing horseback riding. Kraut, who was accompanying them, thought that Calyx was still only 15 years old, a sensitive age. Calyx, irritated by the discomfort, thought that if he ever met the real owner of that body, he would punch him for leaving it in such condition. Kraut took the opportunity to ask why they were going to Poznu, since the original plan was to head straight to the capital. Calyx explained that if they went directly, they might end up encountering the 1st prince along the way, and he preferred to avoid that for now. Kraut asked if he was afraid of the prince, to which Calyx replied sarcastically, comparing the prince to poop on the ground not out of fear, but simply because it's better not to step on it. Kraut found the comparison disrespectful, but Calyx just said that Poznu had actually been in his plans from the beginning. The difference was that he had originally planned to pass through only on the return. However, the order had changed. It wasn't an escape. At least, that's what he tried to convince himself. Kraut thought the young master could have just denied it normally, but was getting too worked up about the situation. Still, he thought Calyx remained very cute. Calyx, on the other hand, reflected on the fact that he was being treated as young and adorable by people even younger than him. Despite that, he needed to reach Class 4 soon. The training with Russell felt endless, and that was actually the real reason for the trip to Poznu. If they managed to conquer the dungeon near that region, Calyx could obtain a level 5 skill. Dungeons with valuable rewards were quite rare. The problem was that with such a weak body, he wouldn't be able to clear a dungeon like that alone. He would need an expedition team. However, forming such a team would attract the attention of nobles in the territory where the dungeon was located, and that would complicate things. Poznu, however, was different. As a free city, there were no meddling nobles. It was easy to hire mercenaries there, making it the perfect place to assemble a team and explore the dungeon safely. Shortly after, Kraut announced they had finally arrived at the free city of Poznu. They headed to the city gates, where a guard handed them a visitor registration form. Calyx was extremely tired. Later, already settled in an inn, Calyx gathered the soldiers who had accompanied him and thanked them for their hard work during the journey. Before they set off again, he suggested they rest from the travel fatigue and asked if anyone knew a good place to relax. The group got excited about the idea, and Kraut, a bit uneasy, tried to convince the young master to drop it, thinking it was reckless. But everyone except him was eager to drink. They then headed to a busy commercial center, where many people were eating and drinking. Thomas commented that he wished there were a place like that in their territory. That's when a boy, likely an employee of one of the bars, approached and pulled them inside, acting like a kind of promoter. Although some soldiers found the approach a bit strange, Calyx agreed to go in. Later, everyone was completely drunk, falling asleep and laughing loudly. Only Kraut remained sober, having not touched a drop of alcohol. He thought it was risky for something to happen to the young master in that condition, and decided it was wiser to stay alert. Meanwhile, Calyx was paying attention to that boy, or maybe teen, who had led them to the bar. He asked if there was a quieter place nearby. Even another shop would do. The boy replied that there was, but he'd get in trouble if he took them elsewhere. Calyx insisted, saying the soldiers were having fun there, and if the boy took him and one more person, it would be fine. He even offered a gold coin in return. The boy obviously accepted, on the condition that the soldiers stayed there. So, Calyx left with Kraut, guided by the boy through the city streets. Along the way, Calyx asked if he had lived in Poznu for long, and the boy replied that he had been living there for over 10 years. Calyx found that curious, since the boy didn't even look that age, and he then said he was 14. Calyx continued the conversation by asking who was the most powerful person in the city. The boy replied that the strongest fighter was supposedly Sir Omar, leader of the mercenary group Steel Shield, although he had never faced the other 3 major mercenary leaders, so it was just a rumor. Calyx asked what the other groups were. The boy was surprised he didn't know, and explained that the 3 biggest mercenary groups were Red Wolf, Blackwing, and Steel Shield, collectively known as the Big 3. Calyx then wanted to know how the monster wave had been last fall. The boy replied that judging by the full taverns, the damage hadn't been too bad. Even so, the adults were worried about the possible arrival of the supermoon. Calyx commented that adults always worried too much, and the boy replied that he didn't seem that old himself. Calyx, pretending to be proud, said he was very mature, just like him. They finally reached their final destination, but were greeted by a woman who told them they didn't have a reservation, and asked what they were doing there. Calyx pointed to the boy, saying he was the one who had brought them there. The woman sighed and asked if Urini was causing trouble again. She then apologized, saying the place was already closed at that time. Meanwhile, Calyx noticed the ring the woman was wearing and stared at it. He commented to Kraut that in that case, he'd have to ask for the money back. Urini protested, saying he had done his job properly and it wasn't his fault. He further explained that Calyx wasn't looking for fun but for information. The woman then shouted his name again, irritated. That's when it became clear it wasn't Urini, but Urini, a girl. Calyx, upon observing her system, finally confirmed his suspicion. The girl's full name was Celestina Urini, 14 years old, from a fallen noble family and one of the so-called children of Herodona. Although her combat class was only 1, she was known as a Tuta, or Gold Hunter, with a 6-star reputation and finances ranked as SS. Calyx thought he had finally found the legendary shadow sorceress, Celestina Urini. That was the real reason for his trip, to find her. Now that he had, he thought it was the perfect time to invest the secret funds he had stolen, and all of it happened by chance. Calyx wondered if, on top of everything, she also had good information. Since Calyx's main objective was already fulfilled, he figured he no longer needed to return the tip to the boy. However, before they could continue the conversation, some women in the hall drew their weapons on them, ordering Urini to step away and come to them immediately. Kraut asked if they even knew who they were pointing those arrows at, but one of the women coldly replied that in high-class places like that, it was rare for unauthorized guests to refuse to leave. According to her, many of those present had combat skills superior even to knights. So, if someone refused to cooperate, there was no choice but to take unpleasant measures. Of course, if they simply left, nothing would happen. Calyx, however, asked if they weren't being too rigid. Continuing to reject everyone who showed up without at least trying to talk would only isolate that group even more. How did they expect to make allies like that? Urini tried to calm things down, saying they were overreacting. Calyx, with irony, remarked that she might have an eternal beauty that defied time, but she didn't seem any wiser than her young protege. The woman, who clearly had known Urini for a long time, understood the talent she possessed. Still, she couldn't afford to let her guard down. If their true identity were revealed, it could put them all at risk. She then agreed to talk, but made it clear that if Calyx didn't want to get shot in the head, he had to answer first. Who exactly was he? Calyx replied that she already knew that, and asked why she didn't just take off the ring and hand it over to Urini. The woman was startled and asked if he understood the meaning of that ring. Calyx explained that the royal seal of Agripatina was clearly engraved on it. It wasn't hard to recognize. He asked if she really didn't want to be identified. She replied that the more Calyx talked, the deeper he got himself into trouble. She called him by name, Prince Calyx. He smiled and asked why. If she already knew his name, she made a point of asking. And more. Was that all she knew? How did she think he had found that place? Then, he asked if she knew what kind of information he was after, and what he was willing to offer in return. The woman fell silent. She thought she couldn't give a direct answer. After all, the only people capable of discovering her identity would be someone from the royal family or a professional assassin. And yet, a foreign heir from a count's family had figured it all out instantly. Calyx understood her confusion, and directly asked Urini what she thought of the situation. She replied with an old saying, the more complex the problem, the simpler the solution. She said the young master was smart and never forgot what he saw. The royal crest of Agripatina appeared in many history books. Maybe he had simply recognized it. And after all, it was the crest of an extinct royal family. Nothing special. Calyx praised her answer, saying she was very clever. Urini, in turn, returned the compliment, saying he was also admirable. The woman, now calmer, sincerely said she understood and ordered the guards to lower their crossbows. She also said the place was too exposed and invited them to continue the conversation inside the building. Calyx noticed that the space was fully prepared. There was food, drink, games, and resting areas. That was the kind of place they were in. He asked if being in a hall with a woman like that didn't create unnecessary tension. attention. She replied that she hadn't yet decided if she would let him leave safely, and asked if he didn't think it was better to try and convince her. Calyx remarked that hospitality was lacking. In places like that, at the very least, they served tea. At least that, the woman agreed to provide. When he saw some elegant young ladies approaching with tea, he recalled how, in the game, Celestina Urini, one of the children of Herodona, was portrayed. She was a member of a shadowy group, but also the most powerful and influential ally funding the Dark Prince Gale. No one surpassed her ability to make money. That's why Calyx had decided to invest all the secret funds he stole with her. He knew she understood that trust was a merchant's greatest asset. But for now, she was still young, and he wondered whether he should let her grow on her own or guide her with his own hands. So, Calyx drank the tea calmly. The woman asked if he didn't suspect it could be poisoned. He replied that he didn't. If it were, he would know. Then she returned to the main topic. They couldn't continue negotiations without trust. They still didn't know if he would keep their identity secret. Calyx, without hesitation, proposed an investment of 100,000 gold coins. He said he was just repeating her own words, and how could she guarantee that she wouldn't run away with his money? That was when Urini reappeared, now better dressed, with a refined appearance. She explained that the amount was too large to refuse, and for the first time, gave her formal introduction. She was a former member of the royal family of Agripatina, now just a fugitive. She asked to be called simply Urini. Calyx noticed how much she had changed. She was acting completely different from before. Come to think of it, she was only 1 year older than his current body. He needed to stay focused. Kraut, curious, asked if all princesses had this incredible ability to generate money. He also said that if she wanted that investment, she needed to explain better how she planned to use it. Urini explained that her organization had a network of fugitives, which allowed them to obtain information very quickly. She mentioned that this was the basics of any business: buy cheap and sell high. However, Calyx pointed out that the distribution market she wanted to enter was extremely competitive. There was no guarantee that her competitors' more established merchants would play by the same rules. Many of them had powerful backers, capable of blocking goods at customs and sabotaging any new venture. Even so, Urini stated that every business involves risks and asked them not to underestimate her organization. They also knew how to deal with smuggling. Calyx replied that, for him, it didn't need to be legal to be useful. Smuggling was hard to trace back to its origin, which aligned with his goal of bringing that kind of activity into the light. Urini then suggested working with stolen cargo or goods recovered from overturned carts. Calyx said that, in that case, at least he could consider it compensation for emotional damage. Urini agreed to the proposal, saying she would keep the stolen goods, but Calyx questioned how he could be sure they wouldn't just run off with his money. She replied that, to guarantee that, she herself would become his hostage. Urini's stepmother was desperate at that decision, but the young woman explained that it had already been 10 years since her people started wandering aimlessly through foreign lands. If they continued that way, the organization would either collapse or become just another criminal group. The amount involved was 100,000 gold, a huge sum, but to Urini, the most important thing wasn't reclaiming her former status, but making sure her people could live without suffering. Calyx then asked them to stop the theatrics, saying it was too much. The stepmother scolded him for his insolence, but Calyx replied that he didn't care about her past. If she wanted to be treated like a princess, she should return to the kingdom of the Union of Jaipur right away. But Urini agreed with him. She declared that, from that moment on, she was renouncing the name Agripatina and the title of princess. Then, she cut her own hair, a gesture that left everyone around her shocked. Right after, Urini remarked that it seemed Calyx already had an idea of what kind of business he wanted to build. He confirmed it. He said that originally, he planned to leave everything under her control, but it was still too soon to trust her completely. In order for that trust to be built, he would guide her himself. Curious, Urini asked how old he was, since he didn't seem much older than her. Calyx thought that, in truth, she was much more mature than one would expect for her age, but he also didn't intend to treat her like an adult. He explained that his role would be to provide the capital, but she would operate the business with someone else's money. That's why the age difference between them was relevant. Urini agreed, but showed interest in learning the full plan. Calyx said that before anything else, they needed to focus on the main objective: information. Urini then asked her stepmother to provide the Lord with all the information they had, especially about the 3 groups controlling Poznu and the current state of the region. Calyx noticed that, moments earlier, that woman had treated Urini as if she were her own daughter. She seemed to be someone very skilled at separating public life from personal matters. He was then taken to a room full of disorganized stacks of documents. Even so, he was ready to begin his investigation. When morning came, he was still there. Calyx knew that convincing Urini and gathering capital wouldn't be his biggest challenges. The real problem was conquering the dungeon. He had 2 options: take the elite members he had already gathered or hire new mercenaries. However, hiring too many people would increase the risk of information leaks. The best option would be to take only an elite group. Still, he would need at least 1 mage. A mage in a group of knights wasn't just another fighter. He changed the entire dynamic of combat, allowing for much stronger strategies and multiplying the team's power. That's why mages were so highly valued. While analyzing some records, Calyx was surprised to find the name of a Class 6 mage living in that region. It was the Hermit of Life, Edelim Beltoa. Immediately, he got up and ran off, determined to get more information about this man. When he tried to visit Urini again, he was greeted by her stepmother, who said she wasn't available. and slammed the door in his face. Shortly after, a kinder maid arrived and said she had prepared tea and snacks for him. She also informed him that urine would be brought to him as soon as her lesson ended. While he waited, Calyx thought about Edelum Beltoa, a Class 6 mage. Like Russell, the territory of Shinsin, after all, had been just a simple barony until the current generation. It was only with Calyx's father, Count Koshirin, that the territory gained any importance. Koshirin himself had reached Class 7 at a young age, but died shortly after becoming Count, before he could consolidate the foundations of his domain. Calyx wasn't even the official heir to the territory of Shigensen, and so he wondered if a Class 6 mage would agree to join him. Either way, he had no choice but to try. After a while, Urine finally showed up, asking what the sudden urgency was and when the business would begin. She wanted to know where the promised capital was. Calyx asked her to calm down. He said they still needed proper preparation before launching the business he had planned. He estimated it would take at least 6 months, maybe even a year. He asked Yuri not to get too excited and then presented her with a balance certificate issued by the Tower of Mages, showing he had deposited 30,000 gold coins. Yuri examined the document and said it looked authentic, but was surprised by the amount. Only 30,000? Calyx asked if she wanted the 100,000 all at once, as if it were easy to show all the capital immediately. Yuri replied that, considering the current value of his territory, that amount was enough for now. With a teasing smile, she even called him Big Bro. That confused Calyx, and he wanted to know the reason for the nickname. She explained that anyone who invested that much money automatically became a big brother to her, and asked if he had a problem with that. Calyx grumbled that it sounded like just a disguised way of calling him a fool, but before he could say more, she changed the subject, wanting to know what important topic he wanted to discuss. Calyx then asked if she knew someone named Edelum Beltoa. Urine's stepmother appeared shortly after, stating that Edelum was under suspicion of being a dark mage. Urine reacted by saying he wasn't. The stepmother agreed she didn't believe it either, but explained that in that world, it was important to avoid any unnecessary suspicion. Sometimes, even when you helped someone, instead of gratitude, you got absurd demands. Calyx thought to himself that he already knew that type of person, and Edelum seemed to have a difficult personality, but he wasn't a bad person. He assured them that if anything happened, he would take full responsibility and asked for directions to find him. The stepmother, though wary, gave in. She said that exiting through Poznu's north gate, one could find a community cemetery at the foot of the village mountains. Next to the cemetery was a small cabin. Someone working there as a mortician was actually Edelum Beltoa. She explained that he had arrived in the village a few years ago and had since isolated himself for his experiments. He was a stubborn man. When Calyx asked if she knew anything recent about his research, she said that mages generally hate having their research secrets exposed, so she didn't know anything new. Urine, listening to everything, asked if Calyx really planned to go to that old man's house. He wanted to know why she was asking, and whether Edelum had done something to her. He noticed that she seemed reluctant to criticize the man, so, probably, she didn't hate him. Urine said that just being near Edelum made her feel like her life energy was being drained. To her, he felt like a demon. She advised Calyx to be very careful, especially with one thing, not to let that man get anywhere near the money that would be invested in her. She firmly stated that the money was already hers and hers alone. Before the conversation could continue, the stepmother said break time was over, and literally dragged Urine back to class. Calyx was left thoughtful. Now he had to find Edelum and convince him to join him. Later, already past Poznu's north gate, Calyx arrived at the community cemetery. He saw the cabin that had been described, which looked like it came straight out of a dark fairy tale like a witch's house. When he knocked on the door, he asked if anyone was there. A voice replied from inside, saying the door was open. Calyx could already tell that this man wasn't normal. Few people would remain so calm living outside the city gates. He didn't seem to fear monsters or bandits. He was definitely someone very strong and confident. When Calyx saw Edelum Beltoa up close, he confirmed his suspicions. The man truly exuded the aura of a dark mage. Even though he had heard of him before, seeing him in person was completely different. Calyx introduced himself, but Edelum said he didn't know much about the world and wouldn't recognize his importance even after hearing his name. Calyx said that wasn't a problem. He came from an unknown family, and even if he were famous, he wouldn't compare to someone who had reached Archmage level. Edelum replied that he talked too much. He said he was busy and that if Calyx didn't get to the point, he'd be kicked out. Without hesitation, Calyx explained that he was planning to conquer a dungeon nearby, and wanted to know if Edelum could help. The mage asked if he meant the dungeon in the Poznu mountain range, and turning to him, said it had been a long time since he'd seen such a crazy brat. Kraut, who was accompanying Calyx, had to hold himself back from slapping that cursed mage for calling the prince that way. Calyx, trying to stay calm, said he wouldn't spare any expense to reward Edelum. The mage wanted to know exactly what Calyx had to offer. He said money only had value if you survived, and advised Calyx to go home if he valued his life. But Calyx insisted. He asked if there was anything Edelum needed for his research. He said he could get whatever was necessary. Edelum, however, grew suspicious. He asked if Calyx was an agent sent by the Magic Tower to investigate investigate his research. The atmosphere turned tense. A heavy silence fell over the place. Then the mage ordered Calyx to leave. Defeated, Calyx returned. When he met Yurin again, she asked if he had lost the money he intended to invest in her. Calyx replied that the old man didn't even seem interested in money. Yurin commented that she figured he'd use that as an excuse to get involved in everything. That's when Calyx, tired of beating around the bush, asked directly what had really happened between her and Edelum. Yurin said that shortly after old Edelum settled nearby, she had invested some money in him, but she ended up getting scammed. It was unbelievable. Calyx found it really shocking, and Kraut was outraged, asking how that was possible. Even if he had no research funds, stealing money from a child was too much. Calyx asked if she at least had a contract, and Yurin replied yes, of course. She wasn't naive with that kind of thing. She had loaned him 30 gold coins. Kraut was even more shocked, saying that amount was 6 years of his salary, and he couldn't understand how she could be so calm after getting scammed. Yurin, indifferent, said it was her money and she could do whatever she wanted with it. She called the old man a bankrupt loser, which deeply offended Kraut. Calyx then said he could take over the contract if she wanted, but Yurin immediately refused. She said she would make that old man work until he paid back every cent of the debt. Calyx commented that might work with a regular person, but did she really think she could do that to a level 6 mage? Yurin asked if there was no way to recover the money, but Calyx explained that she hadn't loaned it, she had invested it. That meant she had accepted the risk of loss too. If she were strong enough to demand repayment, it would be a different story, but she wasn't. Yurin then asked if Calyx was strong enough. He replied that he was a noble with his own territory and had a lot of money. She responded, irritated, that he was only 1 year older and already acted like a god. Calyx realized he was arguing with a child. As much of a genius as Yurin was, she was still inexperienced. The very fact that she believed a contract could control a level 6 mage showed how little she still understood about the world. He explained that a good merchant knows how to accept a loss when an investment fails. If she had gone through the trouble of drafting a contract, she should have at least recorded the research topic and where every coin was invested. Calyx recommended that she give up on the contract because it would be impossible for her. He said he could help her for 50 gold coins, which still represented a 67% profit over a few years. Yurin agreed, but insisted on overseeing everything closely. Later, Calyx already had all the information in hand. There was pile of books, documents, and research records. He was surprised by the amount of material gathered. However, in the middle of the analysis, Yurin's stepmother appeared, asking what exactly she was doing. When Yurin tried to explain, the stepmother became furious. She said she had made it clear that Yurin should never make deals behind her back. Yurin replied that the stepmother always found excuses to reject any deal. In the face of the argument, the stepmother said they were leaving, and as punishment, she announced that today's extra class would be very long. With that settled, Calyx turned his attention back to what mattered. He and his allies spent the whole night studying the documents. Meanwhile, Kraut was already fast asleep until Calyx woke him, saying it was time to leave. They went to the center of Poznu, where there was an office for hiring mercenaries. Yes, that city had a specific place for it. The clerk was surprised to see a high-ranking noble there and wondered what he was doing in a place like that. Calyx said he was there to hire mercenaries. The receptionist felt unqualified to handle it and quickly went to call the manager. When the manager appeared, Kraut instinctively stepped forward to protect Calyx. Even the manager could tell that this guard was no ordinary man. Politely, the manager invited them in. Calyx began the conversation by saying he had heard that class 4 or higher mercenaries were very rare. The manager confirmed it. He explained that when a fighter reaches a certain level of skill, they can settle in rural areas and live as knights. Kraut wondered if that was meant as provocation, but the man continued, saying that many preferred the freedom of mercenary life. The manager commented that he was surprised a noble had come in person. He could have simply sent a representative, but Calyx replied that doing so wouldn't guarantee a proper contract. The manager, observing, thought that the boy was the same age as his grandson but already sharp as a seasoned fox. In the meeting room, Calyx specified the contract terms. The danger level of the mission justified the reward, 2.5 times the average weekly salary, calculated based on each mercenary's experience. The standard contract duration would be 1 month, with possible renewals every 2 weeks, up to a maximum of 3 months. Half the payment would be made in advance. Additionally, if an S-rank mercenary were designated as commander, they would have full authority over the expedition structure. The maximum number of combatants would be 120, with up to 80 people in support roles. The manager knew that, even though he was just a child, Calyx shouldn't be underestimated. He could clearly see that this boy understood much more than he let on. Despite hiding the details of the mission, Calyx presented the conditions in a direct and extremely well-balanced way. The demands were made so precisely that accepting them immediately would be strange, but they were also very difficult to reject. The man said that finding a mercenary group willing to accept those terms would take some effort and asked if more information was available. Calyx said there was, but in that case, the reward amount would need to be reduced. Deep down, Calyx thought that all the negotiation experience this man had built up over his entire life was nothing compared to what he, Calyx, had developed playing that game hundreds of thousands of times. It was an advantage he intended to use to the fullest. In the end, the man gave in and accepted the deal. He had never met a noble like Calyx and, impressed, asked him to do everything possible to ensure the mercenaries came back alive. Calyx promised he would do his best. Later, the negotiator suggested that if Calyx revealed where he was staying, he could send the captain of the mercenaries directly to him to receive the formal request. After that, they could calmly discuss the details. Calyx thought it was an excellent idea and said goodbye for now. Later that night, Calyx appeared visibly nervous. He had really thought they would refuse and was relieved they had accepted. Kraut commented that the negotiation skill Calyx had shown was impressive and asked where he had learned it. Calyx knew he couldn't tell the truth about his past life, so he changed the subject and said they could go to the bar. Meanwhile, a hooded man was watching Calyx's every move from a distance. It was clear he was keeping a close eye on the boy. The city of Poznu was the only free city within the Kingdom of Rock. Because it wasn't subject to noble laws, it was known as a sanctuary for mercenaries. When someone became one, all their past records were erased, no matter if they had been a criminal, a slave, or even a noble from another country. In exchange for this new beginning, every mercenary affiliated with the city was required to participate in the battles against the monster waves that appeared in autumn. These battles were brutal. The monsters were either killed or fed on the mercenaries themselves. In the past, this burden didn't fall only on mercenaries. The first line of defense was made up of prisoners, all criminals, since their deaths didn't cause any public outcry. Over time, that system evolved and gave rise to the group known as Black Wing, which came to dominate both Poznu's entertainment district and the city's underworld. At the headquarters of the Black Wing group, the underworld boss, Valter, was in a meeting with Corvos, and clearly displeased with his presence. But Corvos, unfazed, reminded him that given their past, he was the one who should be demanding Valter's head. As a Dark Knight, he had left the past behind, and now proposed a more civil conversation. Despite being offended, Valter realized that Corvos had reached a high level as a knight, and was already in power, class 6, which made him dangerous. Valter then asked what he wanted. Corvos replied that some nobles had recently arrived in the city, and he wanted to know more about them. He said they had made a suspicious request, and he wanted a full investigation. For that, he offered advance payment, but made it clear that any additional amount would depend on what was discovered. He also warned that if they missed this opportunity, there would be no second chance or payment. Valter immediately ordered his subordinates to bring the records. When the documents arrived, he questioned why that noble was hiring so many mercenaries. Was he planning to start a war? Corvos analyzed the information. The request involved a force estimated at 200 men for a maximum period of 3 months. It didn't look like a war or a territorial dispute. Valter, intrigued, suggested that it might be a dungeon exploration, but noted that this kind of mission was usually carried out by small, specialized teams. Corvos stated that if that were the case, it would be a guaranteed failure, since no one who understood the basics would make such a glaring mistake. Then Valter suggested eliminating all of them, but Corvos explained that the noble was always accompanied by a Class C knight, which complicated the execution. Valter replied that shouldn't be a problem, since Corvos was Class 6. However, Corvos reminded him that if they tried to kill the noble, traces would be left behind, and if he happened to use a return scroll during the attempt, the entire operation would fail. Moreover, scrolls like that were extremely expensive, making the risk even greater. It was hard to imagine that the noble had a return scroll, but Corvos was simply waiting for the perfect opportunity to act. For now, he decided to assume that Calyx's objective really was to explore the dungeon, and it would be best to prepare based on that. Once inside the dungeon, the return scroll would become useless, and that was exactly where Corvos planned to finish off the young noble. Valter commented that, in that case, the only remaining obstacle would be the mercenaries Calyx had hired. But even if they were just hired soldiers, eliminating them would still require additional payment. There were many of them, and in a dungeon with no escape routes, that could become a problem. Corvos didn't hesitate to agree. He said he would pay whatever was necessary after all. The person who had hired him had so much money, they didn't even know how to spend it. It was explained that in Poznu there were 3 major mercenary groups known as the 3 Great Forces. Although there were hundreds of smaller factions, these 3 stood out due to their absolute power. They weren't just the result of regular mercenaries banding together. For example, the Black Wing group was made up of former convicts who had been used as human shields in battles against monsters. The Steel Shield group, on the other hand, consisted of their former jailers, which naturally created mutual hatred. Despite the rivalry, the 2 groups had avoided direct confrontation for a long time. This was only possible because both feared interference from the Red Wolves, the 3rd dominant force in Poznu. Since all 3 were evenly matched in power, the city maintained a fragile peace, with each group closely watching the others. Any military movement, no matter how small, would trigger immediate alarm. Later, at the Steel Shield headquarters, one of the members reported that the Blackwings were secretly recalling their scattered members to the base. This was a sign of mobilization, so they too needed to prepare. Meanwhile, at Urin's house, she asked whether they should take a certain girl with them, since she was considered a hostage. Calyx replied that he hadn't even invested in her yet, which made Urin ask again whether he wouldn't regret leaving her behind. Calyx found it curious how certain she seemed that he would give in. In the end, he agreed to let the girl accompany them up to the dungeon entrance, where she would wait. Urin agreed with the plan. However, Calyx felt the situation was getting strange. The girl's stepmother, now identified as Lady Harry, stepped in, saying this was madness. Taking a child, even a princess, to a dangerous dungeon made no sense. Calix tried to explain that the girl herself had decided to go, and that he wasn't an adult either. Even so, Lady Harry firmly objected and pulled Yurine back to her studies. Calix realized he clearly hadn't made a good first impression in that household. From the start, Lady Harry had been suspicious of him, and now she made it obvious. Meanwhile, a hooded man was still watching Calix. Maybe it was Corvos, maybe not. Later, some people were talking about Yurine and Lady Harry, criticizing the fact that Calix was still around. The same hooded man who had been observing the boy said he had probably seduced young Yurine with promises of wealth, and complained that he had never liked that noble since the first time he saw his face. He then asked what the orders were. A larger man commented that dungeons couldn't be conquered by numbers alone, but another argued that, in this case, it might be a good idea. The tension between the groups was rising. It was inevitable that sooner or later, Steel Shield and Blackwing would clash directly. The plan was simple. They would use the mission as an excuse to move away from the city center, observe the situation, and then decide whether to eliminate or negotiate. Later, a man was sent directly to Calix. He came from the mercenary office headquarters and introduced himself as Trias. He informed Calix that from that point on, all matters related to the hired mercenaries would be handled by him. He also brought an officially issued level S credit guarantee from the office, which proved the seriousness of the contract. Calix thought he was very lucky to have found the right person so quickly. However, since he remained silent for a few seconds, Trias felt uneasy and asked if something was wrong. Calix replied that everything was fine. He said Trias could carry out the work as he saw fit, but warned that if 10 people were needed, it would be better to bring 13. Trias immediately understood why. He knew Calix wanted to personally evaluate each candidate. Even so, he explained that the contract fee paid by those not selected would not be refunded and asked if Calix agreed with that. He confirmed he did. Next, Calix handed Trias a list of all the supplies needed for the dungeon expedition. Each member would be responsible for obtaining at least one of the items. Trias committed to keeping everything confidential and to moving forward with the plan. Calix asked if Trias had any doubts about the mission. Trias replied with a curious question, wanting to know how exactly Calix had discovered that dungeon. Then he asked whether, by any chance, Calix had a favorite hostess at that house. That was when Calix realized he might have just found a potential suitor for Lady Harry. Apparently, that man was interested in her. Disguising his intent, Calix replied that, in fact, he didn't have a favorite. He said he had just been looking for a quiet place when a woman led him there. At first, he hesitated, since the place looked more like a brothel, but to his surprise, he was pleasantly impressed by the comfort it offered. Then he returned the question, curious about the reason behind it. Trias dodged the subject and said it was nothing important. He just wanted to ask. Internally, he felt relieved to know that Calix had no ulterior motives toward Lady Harry. Changing the subject, Trias asked if Calix was thinking of hiring more mercenaries. With his experience, he knew that missions with that level of risk usually came in two types, either suicidal, sending soldiers as cannon fodder, or direct dungeon exploration. Calix understood that Trias realized this wasn't a war, but he had no idea what kind of dungeon Calix was about to face. To confirm his suspicions, Calix asked if, in short, the real problem wouldn't be the monsters, but rather the looters who might show up looking for treasure. Trias agreed and warned him not to underestimate that danger. He emphasized that hiring more people would be expensive, but it might be worth it. Even so, Calix refused. He didn't intend to expand the group. He knew his enemies weren't part of the three major powers in the city, and that made all the difference. Trias then thought that Calix simply wasn't willing to listen. Maybe he believed that simple mercenaries would never dare attack a noble. He even considered being more firm with his recommendation, but gave up on insisting. In the end, he thought it best to just accept it. If everything went wrong, he would only have the option to escape with Yurine and Lady Harry. Before leaving, Trias said he would revise the contract details. An additional request had been added, to gather a force at least 1.3 times the required number of people, and secure all the items listed for the expedition. He also reaffirmed the confidentiality agreement, and asked if Calix agreed. Calix said yes, he could proceed, and thought that now all that remained was to see how it would all turn out. 3 days later, in an open field on the outskirts of Posnu Castle town, Trias reported that, as instructed, they had gathered a total of 260 people. Calix was satisfied. Despite all the dramatic warnings, Trias had done an excellent job. Without wasting time, Calix began pointing them out one by one. That one's out, so is that one, and that one too, eliminating those he didn't want. Then he commented that they were being more persistent than expected. Trias found it strange, and asked if Calix believed there was something behind it. Calix replied that it was necessary to watch those who were pushing to stay. Not all, but many of them were probably infiltrated spies. Trias was surprised and wanted to know how he could be so sure. Calix explained with simple logic. If they were real mercenaries, they would be relieved not to have to carry out such a risky mission. After all, the advance payment already amounted to 50% of the total reward. But if they had been paid by another source and were dismissed, they'd have to return the money. That was why they were so insistent on staying. Trias admitted that it made a lot of sense. Calix then concluded that it wasn't just a logical theory, it was the truth. There might still be infiltrated spies, but with that screening process, he had considerably reduced the risk of a leak. If everything went as planned, they could finally depart. Urine, who was at Calix's side, asked if he had liked the gift she had given him. Calix thought that if it weren't for her, he would never have noticed that one of the three great forces was trying to kill him. He admitted that yes, it had helped a lot. Urine casually replied that she was in the same business as him, so she couldn't just let her employer die. Calix also reflected that, thanks to Urine's personal contact, he had been introduced to Trias, who turned out to be extremely helpful. And, curiously, Trias also seemed drawn to Lady Harry. But Urine soon showed more practical concern. She asked if he was really confident about the monsters in the mountain range. Many said they were as dangerous as those in the Golda Plateau. Calix replied that, in truth, that place was like his backyard. The Impalin mountain range brought back many memories. At that moment, Trias interrupted him, asking if he intended to reveal the group's final destination. He explained that the area was a tangled mess of monster-dominated territories. Marching directly through it would be madness. He asked that at least scouts be sent ahead before advancing. Calix, however, disagreed with the need. Seeing his hesitation, Trias appealed to Kraut, but the knight firmly stated that he trusted his lord. If Calix was making that decision, it was because he had a good reason. Trias, on the other hand, thought that many mercenaries had died in the past because of the stubbornness of nobles. If the losses were too great, there would be no choice but to retreat. And in that case, it would be a real shame. Even so, Calix ordered Kraut to climb a tree and scout the surroundings. Swiftly, Kraut climbed up and, from the top, spotted a goblin village about 500 meters away. Calix replied that there was no need to ask. They were to be wiped out entirely. Kraut, however, warned that the smell of blood could attract more dangerous monsters. But Calix countered, saying that if he was worthy of being called a knight, he just had to make clean cuts and not leave a trail of gore behind. Trias, watching all of this, was impressed. Without any prior reconnaissance, Calix had already detected a group of goblins 500 meters away. That didn't seem possible. Who exactly was this man? Calix then asked what was on the other side. Kraut replied that 400 meters northwest, there was an orc settlement with about 10 huts. Calix said it wasn't a big deal and ordered them all exterminated as well. Trias, stunned, thought that had to be a joke, but Kraut, calmly, reported that to the north, 650 meters away, there was also a knoll settlement, likewise with around 10 huts. Calix, without hesitation, ordered all of them killed too. Trias couldn't understand how they were doing this. It was as if they had eyes in every direction. Everything seemed far too absurd. Subscribe to the channel and leave lots of likes for part 2. See you in the next video.